The dust-covered roads of Willow Creek hadn't seen trouble in years. That was about to change when the Blackwater gang rode into town. What they couldn't know was that the quiet farmer with the ancient shotgun they were about to mock had once been the most decorated marksman in the 5th Infantry Division, a man who hadn't fired a shot in anger for 15 years, until today. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The summer of 1889 brought drought to the farmlands surrounding Willow Creek. The once fertile soil had turned to dust, and the creek that gave the town its name had shrunk to little more than a trickle. On the outskirts of town, Thomas Mason wiped sweat from his brow as he inspected his withering corn crop. At 45, his face was weathered by years of working the land, his once military posture now slightly stupid from countless hours behind a plough. Mason's gaze drifted to the distant horizon, where a plume of dust signaled approaching riders. His hand unconsciously moved to touch the worn wooden stock of the shotgun that leaned against the fence post beside him. The Remington Model 1876 had belonged to his father, its barrel polished smooth by generations of careful handling. Most folks in town thought it strange that a man who rarely hunted kept such an old firearm within reach, but old habits die hard. Inside the modest farmhouse, Emma Mason stirred a pot of stew with one hand while cradling their 3-year-old daughter Sarah with the other. At 38, Emma's blonde hair was beginning to show strands of silver, but her eyes remained as bright and determined as the day Thomas had first met her in Denver, shortly after he'd left the army. "Pa's coming," announced their 10-year-old son William, who had been watching from the window. "And there's riders coming from town." Emma set down the wooden spoon and moved to the window. The approaching dust cloud had resolved itself into 5 horsemen riding hard toward Willow Creek's main street. "That doesn't look like the Jackson boys," she said quietly. Outside, Mason squinted at the riders. Something about their formation, the way they spaced themselves evenly across the road, triggered memories he'd spent 15 years trying to forget. He picked up the shotgun and walked slowly toward the house. Jedediah Blackwell led his men into Willow Creek with the confidence of a man accustomed to taking what he wanted. At 35, Blackwell had spent nearly half his life living outside the law. The scar that ran from his left eye to the corner of his mouth had earned him the nickname Half-Smile among those brave or foolish enough to speak it aloud. Riding to his right was his younger brother Isaac, whose quick trigger finger had earned him a reputation throughout 3 territories. Behind them rode the O'Malley brothers, Patrick and Sean, Irish immigrants whose expertise with dynamite had made them valuable additions to the Blackwater gang. Bringing up the rear was Clayton Porter, a former cavalry scout whose tracking skills had helped the gang escape lawmen on numerous occasions. "Looks like a quiet little place," Isaac remarked, adjusting his hat against the midday sun. "Quiet means soft," Jedediah replied with a grim smile, "and soft means easy pickings." The Blackwater gang had been moving eastward for months, staying one step ahead of a persistent U.S. Marshal named Hollister. 3 bank robberies and a train heist had filled their saddlebags, but Jedediah wasn't one to rest on his laurels. Willow Creek might be small, but its bank held the savings of every farmer and rancher for 20 miles. Sheriff Daniel Wilson stood on the porch of Willow Creek's modest jailhouse, watching the approaching riders with growing unease. At 52, Wilson had been sheriff for nearly 2 decades, though sheriff was perhaps too grand a title for the man who maintained order in a town of barely 500 souls. His deputy, young Matthew Collins, emerged from the jailhouse with a concerned expression. "Trouble?" asked Collins, adjusting the badge that still felt new on his chest after just 6 months as deputy. "Maybe," Wilson replied, his hand moving. to rest on the handle of his Colt revolver. Go fetch Dr. Harmon and tell him to stay close to his office. Then find Judge Parker and ask him to keep folks off the streets for a bit. As Collins hurried away, Wilson stepped into the street. He'd seen men like these before, hard men who brought violence wherever they went. His only advantage was that he knew every inch of Willow Creek, every alley and rooftop, where he might position the handful of townsmen willing to stand with him if trouble started. The riders slowed as they approached, 5 pairs of eyes evaluating the silver star on Wilson's chest. "Welcome to Willow Creek, gentlemen," Wilson called out, his voice steady despite the tension building in his chest. "What brings you to our town?" Jedediah Blackwell looked down at the sheriff, taking measure of the older man. "Just passing through, looking for supplies and maybe a hot meal." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Any recommendations?" "Sarah's Diner serves a fine beef stew," Wilson replied evenly. "Bank's closed for the day, though. Manager's gone to Council Bluffs until Monday." The slight narrowing of Blackwell's eyes told Wilson his guess had been correct. These men hadn't come for beef stew. "Well, that's a shame," Blackwell said, "but we've got other business to attend to anyway. Boys, let's find that diner." As the gang dismounted and tied their horses at the hitching post outside the diner, Wilson returned to the jailhouse. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a dusty logbook. Flipping through the wanted posters stuffed between its pages, he found what he was looking for. Wanted. Jedediah and Isaac Blackwell, armed robbery and murder, $1,000 reward. Outside the window, he could see Matthew Collins returning. "At a brisk walk. Dr. Harmon's ready," Collins reported, "and Judge Parker's spreading the word. What's the plan, Sheriff?" Wilson sighed heavily. "For now, we wait. I'm not starting a gunfight in the middle of town if I can't help it. But send Bill over to the Mason farm. Thomas should know there's trouble brewing." Collins looked confused. "The farmer? What good will that do?" Wilson gave his deputy a long look. "Mason wasn't always a farmer, son. Before he planted corn, he sowed a different kind of seed altogether. In Sarah's Diner, the Blackwater gang had commandeered the largest table. The few other patrons had quickly finished their meals and departed, leaving only Sarah Henderson herself to serve the newcomers. "5 coffee and whatever's in that pot," Jedediah ordered, not bothering to look at the nervous woman. As they ate, the gang discussed their plans in low voices. "Bank's got a rear entrance," Porter reported. "Simple lock, no guard. Town this size, they won't have much security." Patrick O'Malley nodded. "We go at dawn tomorrow. In and out before anyone the wiser." "What about the sheriff?" Sean asked. Glancing out the window toward the jailhouse, Isaac snorted. "Old man with a 6-shooter and a baby-faced deputy? Hardly worth worrying about." Jedediah's attention was drawn to the street outside, where a boy of about 12 was running toward a farmhouse visible on the outskirts of town. "Looks like we've been announced," he muttered. Billy Thompson burst into the Mason farmyard, his young face flushed with excitement. "Mr. Mason, Sheriff Wilson sent me to tell you there's outlaws in town." Thomas Mason set down the water bucket he'd been carrying. "Calm down, Billy. What kind of outlaws?" "The Blackwater gang." Sheriff recognized them from wanted posters. "They're at Sarah's Diner now, but he thinks they're planning to rob the bank." Mason's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "I see. Tell Sheriff Wilson I'll be along shortly." After Billy had run back toward town, Emma emerged from the house. "Thomas, what is it?" "Nothing to worry about," he said, his voice deliberately calm. "Just some trouble in town. I'm going to help Daniel sort it out." Emma's eyes searched his face. She knew her husband well enough to recognize the change that had come over him, the slight straightening of his posture, the deliberate calm in his movements that belied the alertness she could see in his eyes. "They're not just passing through, are they?" she asked quietly. "Probably not," Mason admitted. "Take the children to the storm cellar and stay there until I come for you." As Emma gathered the children, Mason went to the bedroom and knelt beside the bed. From underneath, he pulled a long wooden box that hadn't been opened in 15 years. The brass hinges creaked as he lifted the lid, revealing a disassembled Springfield rifle nestled in oiled cloth, along with several boxes of ammunition and a medal that glinted in the afternoon light, the Distinguished Marksman badge of the United States Army. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Mason's hands moved with practiced efficiency, assembling the rifle with movements so deeply ingrained they required no conscious thought. In 4 minutes, the weapon was complete. He loaded it, then reached for the shotgun as well. Outside, he secured the rifle to his saddle and mounted his horse. As he rode toward town, his mind turned to a time he'd tried to forget, the campaigns against the Sioux, the long-range shots that had made him a legend in the 5th Infantry, and the vow he'd made upon leaving that life behind. The sun was beginning to set as Thomas Mason rode into Willow Creek, the ancient shotgun cradled in his arms like an old friend, looking for all the world like just another farmer coming to town for supplies. None would guess that beneath his weathered exterior lay the steady hands and keen eyes of a man who had once dropped a Sioux war chief at 800 yards. The Willow Creek Saloon was the only establishment still open as evening settled over the town. Inside, the Blackwater gang had claimed the largest table, their laughter growing louder with each bottle emptied. The few locals brave enough to remain sat in nervous silence, drinking quickly before slipping out into the night. "Tomorrow's gonna be easy pickings," Isaac Blackwell said, slamming his empty glass down. "Did you see the look on that sheriff's face? Man's probably counting the days to retirement." Jedediah nodded, his eyes constantly scanning the room. "Don't get cocky. Easy jobs turn hard when you least expect it." The saloon doors swung open, and Thomas Mason stepped inside. The conversations died as he crossed to the bar, the old shotgun held casually in the crook of his arm. No one in Willow Creek had ever seen Mason in the saloon before. He was known to be a family man who avoided strong drink. "Evening, Howard," Mason greeted the bartender. "I need some shells for this old thing." He set the shotgun on the bar. "Got any that might fit?" Howard nodded nervously, his eyes darting toward the Blackwater table. "Think I might have some in the back. Give me a minute." As the bartender disappeared into the storeroom, Sean O'Malley nudged his brother. "Get a load of the farmer with the antique," Patrick chuckled. "Probably hasn't been fired since the War of 1812. Mason gave no indication he'd heard them, though his posture remained alert as he waited. Behind the casual demeanor, his trained eyes had already assessed each man at the table, noting their weapons and positioning. Isaac Blackwell pushed his chair back with a scrape and sauntered over to the bar. "That's quite a relic you got there, old-timer." He ran a finger along the worn barrel of the shotgun. "My grandpa had one just like it. Good for scaring crows, not much else." Mason turned slightly. "It does the job." "What job is that?" "Shooting rabbits." Isaac picked up the shotgun, examining it with exaggerated care. "Barrel's so worn I'm surprised it doesn't blow up in your face." The saloon had gone completely silent. Even the piano player had stopped mid-tune. "I'd appreciate it if you'd put that down," Mason said quietly. Isaac grinned, showcasing a gold tooth. "Or what, farmer? You're going to plant me in your cornfield." He spun the shotgun carelessly, pointing it around the room. In one fluid motion that belied his years, Mason's hand shot out, gripping Isaac's wrist with enough force to make the younger man wince. With his other hand, he reclaimed the shotgun. I said, "Put it down." For a tense moment, Isaac considered his options. Then he laughed, raising his hands in mock surrender. "No harm meant, friend. Just admiring your museum piece." From the table, Jedediah watched the exchange with narrowed eyes. Unlike his brother, he had noticed the way Mason moved, the economy of motion, the balance, the hands that were calloused but steady. Those weren't just a farmer's hands. Howard returned with a box of shells. These should fit that old Remington, Thomas. Mason paid for the ammunition and pocketed it without loading the shotgun. Obligated. He nodded to the bartender, then turned to leave. "Hold up there, farmer," Jedediah called. "Why don't you join us for a drink? My brother's buying to apologize for handling your property." Mason paused. "Another time, perhaps. My wife's expecting me back." "The wife's got you on a short leash, huh?" Isaac sneered, returning to the table. "What kind of man lets a woman—" "Shut up, Isaac," Jedediah cut him off, his eyes still fixed on Mason. "No offense meant, Mr. Mason. Thomas Mason." A flicker of recognition crossed Jedediah's face. "Mason. That name rings a bell." He tapped a finger against his glass. "You serve in the war?" "Didn't most men our age?" Mason replied evenly. Jedediah nodded slowly. "I suppose they did. Well, Mr. Mason, enjoy your evening." As Mason left the saloon, Clayton Porter leaned forward. "What was that about, Jed? You know that farmer?" Jedediah took a long drink before answering. "Not sure. Name sounds familiar, though." He glanced at the saloon doors. "Porter, follow him, see where he goes." Sheriff Wilson was waiting outside the saloon, leaning against a hitching post. "Didn't expect to see you in there, Thomas." Mason shrugged. "I need to get a look at them." And 5 men, all armed. The leader, Blackwell. He's smart, cautious. The others follow his lead, except maybe the brother. Mason handed Wilson the box of shotgun shells. "Keep these. I won't need them." Wilson's eyebrows rose. "Planning on using something else?" "I've got what I need at home." Mason's voice was quiet but firm. "Daniel, get word to Judge Parker. Have him evacuate the east side of town before dawn. I'll handle the rest." The sheriff shook his head. "This isn't Fort Laramie, Thomas. These are outlaws, not warriors. Let the law handle it. The law in Willow Creek is you, a green deputy, and whatever townsfolk you can deputize who know which end of a gun to hold." Mason's expression softened slightly. "No disrespect intended, but we both know how this plays out if they decide to make trouble." Wilson couldn't argue with that. "What's your plan?" First light, the ridge overlooking the bank. Mason mounted his horse. "Just keep people clear and be ready when it starts." As Mason rode away, Wilson noticed a shadow detach itself from the alley beside the saloon and follow on horseback. He considered calling out a warning, but thought better of it. Thomas Mason didn't need warning. The men following him did. Clayton Porter was considered one of the best trackers west of the Mississippi, but following Thomas Mason proved unexpectedly challenging. The farmer seemed to anticipate when Porter would have a clear line of sight, choosing those moments to disappear around bends or behind stands of trees. By the time Porter reached the Mason farmhouse, he was no longer certain whether he was the hunter or the hunted. He dismounted at the edge of the property, tethering his horse behind a cluster of bushes before approaching on foot. The farmhouse was dark except for a single lantern burning in an upstairs window. Porter crept closer, keeping to the shadows. He reached the barn and peered through a crack between the boards. Inside, Mason was opening a long wooden box. Porter's eyes widened as he saw the farmer assemble a military-grade Springfield rifle with practiced ease. Next came a Colt revolver that Mason checked and loaded with the efficiency of a man who had done so thousands of times. Porter had seen enough. He backed away from the barn, intending to report to Jedediah when a voice spoke directly behind him. "It's not polite to spy on folks after dark, mister." Porter froze, then slowly raised his hands. He hadn't heard anyone approach, an impossibility for a man with his training. "Turn around slowly." Porter complied, finding himself face to face with a boy of about 10, who held a lantern in one hand and improbably the ancient shotgun in the other. "William," Mason's voice called from the barn doorway, "I told you to stay in the house with your mother. Saw him sneaking around from my window, Pa." the boy replied, not taking his eyes off Porter. "Thought you should know." Mason stepped forward, taking the shotgun from his son. "Go back inside now." As William reluctantly retreated to the house, Mason gestured with the shotgun barrel. "Your friends send you to check up on me?" Porter nodded, seeing no point in denying it. "Jed was curious about you." "And what will you tell him?" Porter considered his options. "The truth, that you're more than you appear to be." Mason seemed to weigh something in his mind. "Tell him this instead. If the Blackwater gang is still in Willow Creek by noon tomorrow, none of you will leave alive." He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "I've killed better men than Jedediah Blackwell, and for better reasons." Something in Mason's tone made Porter believe him completely. "I'll deliver your message. See that you do." Mason lowered the shotgun. "Now ride back to town. And the porter," he called as the tracker returned to his horse, "if I see you near my family again, we won't have another conversation." Back at the saloon, Jedediah Blackwell was growing impatient when Porter finally returned, his expression troubled. "Well, what did you find out?" Porter took a seat, pouring himself a generous whiskey before answering. "We should leave, tonight." Isaac laughed. "Because of one farmer with an antique shotgun?" "That farmer is Thomas Mason," Porter said quietly, "former sergeant of the 5th Infantry." Jedediah's face darkened. "The Marksman, the one they called 3 Mile Mason." Porter nodded. "The same, and he said if we're still here by noon tomorrow, none of us is leaving alive." A heavy silence fell over the table. Even Isaac looked concerned. "He's just one man," Patrick O'Malley ventured after a moment. "One man who once held off 30 Sioux warriors by himself at Broken Ridge," Jedediah countered. "One man who could put a bullet through your eye at 1,000 yards. He drummed his fingers on the table, thinking. "So we leave," Sean suggested. Jedediah's expression hardened. "No, we came to that bank and we're taking it." He leaned forward. "But we changed the plan. We go tonight, not tomorrow. Mason won't expect that." Isaac grinned, his earlier concern evaporating. "And after the bank, we pay. Farmer Mason a visit. Family men have a lot to lose." Jedediah nodded slowly. "Get the horses ready. We move in 1 hour." What none of them realized was that Thomas Mason had anticipated this very decision. From the ridge overlooking the town, where he had positioned himself immediately after his conversation with Porter, he watched through his scope as the Blackwater gang prepared for their midnight raid. The Springfield rifle rested comfortably against his shoulder, its familiar weight a reminder of the man he had once been and was about to become again. A half-moon hung in the cloudless sky, casting Willow Creek in silver light. From his position on the ridge, Thomas Mason had a perfect view of Main Street and the red brick building that housed the town's modest bank. Through his scope, he watched as lamplight flickered in the saloon where the Blackwater gang finalized their hastily revised plans. Mason controlled his breathing, 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out, just as he had been taught decades ago. The guiche rhythm calmed his mind and steadied his hands. 15 years had passed since he'd last looked through a rifle scope with intent, but the old instincts returned, as if they'd never left. He adjusted the Springfield slightly, compensating for the gentle breeze that rustled the pines around him. At this distance, wind barely mattered, but precision had always been Mason's religion. In town, Deputy Collins made his evening rounds, unaware of the danger brewing. Mason tracked him through the scope as the young man checked storefront doors and greeted the few townsfolk still on the boardwalks. The deputy's route would take him directly past the bank in approximately 7 minutes, right when the Blackwater gang would be making their move. Mason shifted his position slightly and whispered a silent prayer that what he was about to do would be enough. In the back room of the saloon, Jedediah Blackwell outlined the plan one final time. "Porter, you and Sean take the horses around back. Patrick, you'll handle the lock. Isaac and I will go in first." He checked his pocket watch. "We move in 10 minutes, when the deputy passes the bank on his rounds." Isaac twirled his revolver. "And if anyone gets in our way, no killing unless necessary," Jedediah said firmly. "We're not here to start a war." Clayton Porter looked unconvinced. "What about Mason? He knows we're here." "Mason's expecting us to hit the bank at dawn. By the time he realizes what's happening, we'll be halfway to the territorial line." Jedediah tucked his own revolver into its holster. "Any questions?" The O'Malley brothers exchanged glances. "What if the safe's time-locked?" Patrick asked. "Can't blast it without waking the town." "Small-town bank like this won't have anything that's sophisticated," Jedediah assured him. "Standard combination lock, nothing more." As the others made final preparations, Jedediah stepped outside for a final look at the quiet town. His instincts, honed through years of outlawry, sensed something wasn't right. The night was too still, the street too empty. He scanned the surrounding hills and ridgelines, but saw nothing unusual. Just nerves, he told himself, though he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Deputy Collins paused outside the Mercantile to light his pipe, the match flaring briefly in the darkness. Through his scope, Mason could see the young man's face clearly, barely more than a boy's, trying to look official despite his obvious inexperience. The deputy would reach the bank in less than 5 minutes. At the same time, Mason could see shadowy figures beginning to move behind the saloon. The Blackwater gang was starting their approach earlier than he'd anticipated. Mason had a choice to make: alert the deputy and potentially spark a gunfight in the middle of town, or let the mass robbery proceed while he maintained his tactical advantage. He made his decision, adjusting his aim toward the bank's rear entrance. Patrick O'Malley knelt before the bank's back door, lockpicks working with practiced precision. "Almost got it," he whispered to his brother, who kept watch in the alley. "Hurry up," Sean urged. "Porter says the deputy's coming up Main Street." The lock clicked open and Patrick grinned triumphantly. "Told you, small-town locks are all the same." As he turned to signal the others, a shot rang out. The lockpick in Patrick's hand shattered, along with a small piece of the doorframe mere inches from his fingers. Sean pulled his brother away from the door. "Sniper!" A second shot kicked up dust at their feet, driving them further back into the shadows of the alley. Porter appeared at the corner, his revolver drawn. "What happened?" "Someone's shooting at us," Patrick hissed, nursing his stinging hand. "Nearly took my fingers off." From the ridge, Mason chambered another round. The warning shots had their intended effect. The outlaws were now alert to his presence, without anyone being injured. He shifted his aim toward the front of the bank, where Jedediah and Isaac would be approaching. The first shots caused immediate chaos. Deputy Collins drew his revolver and ran toward the bank, while townspeople emerged from their homes and businesses to see what was happening. Jedediah grabbed Isaac's arm, pulling him back against the wall of the hardware store. "Mason!" he growled. He knew. Isaac started to draw his gun. "Let me go after him." "Don't be a fool. He's got the high ground and a rifle." Jedediah peered around the corner, trying to locate the source of the shots. "We need to regroup." Before they could move, Sheriff Wilson's voice boomed from across the street. "Blackwell, this doesn't have to get bloody," Jedediah cursed under his breath. Their element of surprise was completely lost. Mason watched through his scope as townspeople began to fill the street, drawn by the commotion. This wasn't what he'd planned. Civilians in the potential line of fire complicated everything. He spotted movement at the corner of the hardware store. Jedediah, using the gathering crowd as cover, while trying to reach his men in the alley. Mason drew a bead on him, but held his fire. Too many innocents nearby. Instead, he shifted his aim to a stack of empty barrels near the outlaw's position and squeezed the trigger. The barrels exploded as the bullet tore through them, sending splinters flying and forcing Jedediah to retreat. Another adjustment, another shot. this one striking the ground at Isaac's feet as he tried to circle behind the gathering crowd. The message was clear. Mason could hit them any time he chose. In the saloon, Howard the bartender passed rifles from a hidden cache to several determined-looking townsmen. Judge Parker, a former Texas Ranger before turning to law, checked the action on a well-maintained Winchester. "Mason's giving us time to organize," the judge said. "Let's not waste it." Outside, the situation was deteriorating. The Blackwater gang, split into two groups and pinned down by Mason's precision fire, began shooting back, not at the unseen sniper on the ridge, but at Sheriff Wilson and Deputy Collins, who had taken cover behind a water trough. "They're getting desperate," Wilson told his deputy. "That makes them dangerous." Collins nodded nervously, his hands shaking slightly as he reloaded his revolver. "What do? We hold them here until Mason can pick them off or force them to surrender." Wilson peered over the trough, ducking back as a bullet splintered the wood near his head. "If we're lucky, they'll realize they're trapped and give up." Luck, however, wasn't on Willow Creek's side that night. Sean O'Malley had worked his way to the rear of the gunsmith's shop, where a small window offered access. Inside, he found exactly what he needed: ammunition and a Winchester rifle with a scope nearly as good as Mason's. He slipped back out to the alley where his brother and Porter waited. "I've got a plan," he said, showing them the rifle. "Mason can't hit what he can't see." Patrick understood immediately. "Smoke him out." Sean nodded. "There's kerosene in the back of the shop. We start fires at both ends of town. Mason will either have to move position or be blinded by the smoke." Porter hesitated. "Jed said no unnecessary violence." "It's us or them now," Sean argued. "Besides, we're not aiming to burn down the town, just create enough distraction to even the odds." Before Porter could object further, gunfire erupted from the front of the bank. The outlaws' debate was cut short as they rushed to join the fight. Mason saw the danger unfolding below. What had started as controlled warning shots had escalated into a full exchange of gunfire. He counted at least 3 wounded townspeople being dragged to safety as the Blackwater gang grew increasingly reckless. He sighted on Jedediah, who had taken position behind a stone hitching post. A difficult shot, but one Mason could make. His finger tightened on the trigger, then movement caught his eye. Sean O'Malley running between buildings with something in his arms. Mason shifted his aim, recognizing the object just in time: a kerosene lantern. The shot rang out, and the lantern exploded in Sean's hands, splashing him with burning oil. The outlaw's screams echoed through the town as he rolled on the ground, trying to extinguish the flames engulfing his clothes. Patrick abandoned his cover to help his brother, dragging him toward the horse trough. Mason could have taken the shot but chose not to. Even now, he wasn't a man who shot another in the back. From his position, Jedediah watched the O'Malley's plan fall apart. With Sean injured and Patrick exposed, their tactical situation was worsening by the minute. He glanced toward Porter, signaling a retreat, but Porter shook his head, pointing toward the stables. Their horses were now guarded by armed townsmen. The escape route was cut off. "We need to find another way out," Jedediah called to Isaac across the street. Isaac, always more reckless than his brother, responded by firing wildly at the ridge where Mason was positioned. "Come down and fight fair, you coward!" His challenge was answered by a shot so precise it struck the gun in Isaac's hand, sending it spinning into the dust. Isaac clutched his stinging fingers, staring in disbelief at his damaged weapon. A voice called down from somewhere on the ridge, carrying clearly in the night air. "That was your last warning, Blackwell. Surrender now." Jedediah looked at his injured brother, at Sean O'Malley being treated for burns by his distraught brother, at Porter pinned down behind a water barrel. Their position was untenable. "What's it going to be?" Sheriff Wilson called. "Give up now, and you'll get a fair trial." Jedediah knew what fair meant in frontier justice, a short drop at the end of a long rope. He had one card left to play. "Porter," he whispered. The farmer's family. Porter's eyes widened. Jed, no. They're innocent. Nothing's innocent in war, Jedediah replied coldly. Get to your horse. Use the confusion. Find the Mason farm. Porter hesitated, moral qualms warring with years of loyalty to Jedediah. Finally, he nodded grimly and slipped away into the shadows between buildings. On the ridge, Mason tracked the gunfight below, unaware that the most dangerous threat was now moving silently toward his unprotected home and family. Emma Mason hadn't slept. Despite Thomas's instructions to remain in the storm cellar with the children, she emerged after an hour, unable to bear the confinement. The distant popping of gunfire from town confirmed her worst fears. Trouble had found them again, just as it had in Wyoming Territory all those years ago. She moved silently through the darkened farmhouse, checking on her sleeping children. 3-year-old Sarah clutched her rag doll even in sleep, while William's bed was empty. Emma sighed, knowing exactly where she'd find her son. In the kitchen, William sat by the window with the old brass spyglass that had been his grandfather's, peering toward town. You should be in the cellar, Emma said, keeping her voice gentle despite her worry. William didn't look away from the spyglass. Pa's out there, I can see the flashes when he fires. Emma placed a hand on his shoulder. Your father can take care of himself. I know, William replied with a child's unwavering confidence. Pa's the best shot in the territory. He lowered the spyglass, looking up at his mother with serious eyes. That's why we had to leave Fort Laramie, isn't it? Because people were always looking for him. Emma hesitated. They'd never directly explained to William why they'd abandoned their previous life for the isolation of farming. That's part of it, she admitted. Your father wanted a quieter life for us. But he still practices, William said. When he thinks, no one's watching, behind the North Ridge with tin cans. Emma wasn't surprised that William had noticed. The boy missed very little, another trait inherited from his father. Some habits are hard to break, she said. She was about to insist they return to the cellar when William stiffened, the spyglass raised again. Someone's coming, he whispered. Not Pa. Emma moved to the window, taking the spyglass. In the moonlight, she could make out a lone rider approaching from the south, avoiding the main road from town. Her heart sank. Thomas would have come directly from the ridge to the north. Get your sister, she ordered, her voice suddenly hard. Back to the cellar, now. William ran to obey, recognizing the tone that brooked no argument. Emma moved quickly to the old trunk in the corner, unlocking it with a key she kept on a chain, around her neck. Inside lay a Colt Navy revolver, her own, not Thomas's, and a box of ammunition. By the time Clayton Porter reached the edge of the Mason property, Emma had the children safely in the cellar, the house dark save for a single candle in the kitchen window. She sat in Thomas's rocking chair, the revolver hidden in the folds of her apron, and waited. On the ridge above town, Mason sensed something was wrong. The gunfight had settled into a stalemate, with the Blackwater gang pinned down, but still, dangerous. He did another head count through his scope, Jedediah behind the hitching post, Isaac nursing his injured hand in the doorway of the hardware store, the O'Malley brothers sheltering in the alley beside the bank. 4 men. Where was the 5th? Where was Porter? A cold dread settled in Mason's stomach as he realized the tracker was nowhere to be seen. Mason quickly scanned the area around the stables, the saloon and the side streets. Nothing. He had to make a choice, maintain his position securing the town or return to the farm to check on his family. Before he could decide, movement caught. His eye, Jedediah was waving a white handkerchief. Sheriff Wilson, the outlaw leader called. Let's talk terms. Mason watched as Wilson cautiously emerged from cover, keeping his revolver trained on Blackwell. What terms? You're surrounded, outgunned, and out of options. Jedediah smiled thinly. Not quite all out of options. He gestured toward the hills. Your marksman friend up there, Mason, might want to know that my man Porter is paying a visit to his farm right about now." Even from a distance, Mason could see Wilson's face pale. The sheriff glanced toward the ridge, though he couldn't possibly see Mason in the darkness. "You're bluffing," Wilson replied, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Am I?" Jedediah's smile widened. "Porter's the best tracker in 3 territories. By now he's probably introducing himself to Mrs. Mason and those 2 young'uns." Mason didn't wait to hear more. Slinging the rifle over his shoulder, he raced to where his horse was tethered, heart pounding with fear, unlike anything he'd felt on any battlefield. Porter approached the Mason farmhouse cautiously. Years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct was now screaming that this was wrong. Using women and children as leverage went against his personal code, but loyalty. Jedediah ran deep. He dismounted some distance from the house, tethering his horse to a fence post. The building was dark except for a single light in what appeared to be the kitchen. As he crept closer, he could make out a figure in a rocking chair near the window. Porter drew his revolver and moved to the back door, testing it gently. Unlocked. He eased it open and slipped inside. The kitchen was warm, a pot of coffee simmering on the stove. The figure in the rocking chair was a woman, presumably Mrs. Mason, her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm as she regarded the intruder. "Mr. Porter, I presume," Emma said, her voice steady. "I've been expecting you." Porter blinked in surprise. "You know who I am?" "I know what you are," Emma replied. "A man who's made a terrible mistake tonight." Porter kept his revolver pointed at the floor, uncomfortable with directly threatening a woman despite his mission. "Ma'am, I don't want to hurt anyone. I just need you and your children to come with me." "My children aren't here," Emma said. "I sent them away when I saw you coming." Porter's eyes narrowed, assessing whether she was bluffing. "Where would you send them in the middle of the night?" "To the Wilkerson farm, a mile east." Emma rocked gently in the chair. Nancy Wilkerson was expecting them. "We have an arrangement. You see, for situations exactly like this one." Porter wasn't certain he believed her, but the confidence in her voice gave him pause. "Even if that's true, you're still coming with me. To be used as a hostage against my husband." Emma shook her head. "I don't think so, Mr. Porter." In one smooth motion, the hidden revolver appeared in her hand, aimed directly at his chest. "Thomas isn't the only one in this family who knows how to use a firearm." Porter froze, cursing himself for underestimating the woman. "Mrs. Mason, think about what you're doing. If I don't return with you, Jedediah will kill your husband and anyone who stands with him. Thomas has faced worse odds." The revolver in Emma's hand didn't waver. "Now, you have a choice to make. You can drop your gun and wait for my husband to return, or you can try your luck against me." Porter considered his options. He had no doubt he could outshoot this farmer's wife if it came to it, but something in her steady gaze gave him pause. This wasn't fear or bravado. This was the same calm certainty he'd seen in Thomas Mason's eyes. Before he could decide, the sound of the cellar door creaking open drew his attention. Porter turned to see young William Mason emerging from the kitchen pantry, the ancient shotgun clutched in his small hands. "I told you to stay hidden," Emma said, not taking her eyes off Porter. "Pa always says Masons stand together," William replied, his voice only slightly trembling as he pointed the shotgun at the intruder. Porter almost laughed at the absurdity of the situation, outmaneuvered by a woman and a child with an antique weapon. "That thing's liable to blow up in your hands, boy." "Maybe," William agreed, "but at this distance, it'll take you with it." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, if not for the sound of approaching hoofbeats, fast and hard. Porter tensed, recognizing the urgency in the rhythm. "That'll be Thomas," Emma said calmly. "Last chance to put down your weapon, Mr. Porter." Porter made his decision. Slowly, he bent and placed his revolver on the floor. "You win, Mrs. Mason." Emma nodded to William, who quickly retrieved Porter's gun. A wise choice. Moments later, Thomas Mason burst through the door, his own revolver drawn and ready. He took in the scene, Porter standing with his hands raised, Emma still aiming her Colt, and William holding the shotgun with Porter's revolver tucked into his belt. "Seems I wasn't needed after all," Mason said, the tension in his body easing slightly as he saw his family unharmed. "We had it under control," Emma replied with the hint of a smile, "but I'm glad you're here." Mason turned his attention to Porter. "You made the right decision." "Didn't feel like I had much choice," Porter admitted ruefully. "Your family's formidable." "Mason, you don't know half of it." Mason nodded toward the kitchen chair. "Sit, we need to talk." He turned to William. "Take your sister back upstairs. The danger's past." As William disappeared into the pantry, Porter's eyes widened in understanding. "The cellar, they were here all along." "A mother will say anything to protect her children," Emma said, finally lowering her revolver. "Even lie to a dangerous man." Mason retrieved a length of rope from a drawer and bound Porter's hands. What was Jedediah's plan? Porter sighed heavily. "Use your family as leverage to secure safe passage out of town. It wasn't my idea, Mason, but you went along with it. Jed's like a brother to me." Porter met Mason's gaze evenly. "You, of all people, should understand following a man into questionable territory out of loyalty." Mason's expression darkened at the reference to his military past. "That was different, was it?" Porter asked quietly. "We both know what it's like to do things we're not proud of because someone we respect asked it of us." For a moment Mason seemed lost in thought. Then he turned to Emma. "Are the children really all right?" She nodded. "Scared but unharmed." Mason exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "I need to get back to town. The situation's still unstable." "What about him?" Emma gestured toward Porter. Mason considered the tracker thoughtfully. "He's coming with me." "Porter's?" His brows rose in surprise. "As your prisoner?" "As my insurance," Mason replied, "and maybe something more." A plan was forming in his mind, one that might end the night without further bloodshed. "You said Jedediah's like a brother to you. How far does that loyalty go?" "I won't betray him," Porter said firmly. "I'm not asking you to." Mason united Porter's hands. "I'm asking you to help save his life." In town, the standoff continued. Jedediah had withdrawn his men to the saloon after delivering his ultimatum, confident that Mason would soon return with Porter and hostages in tow. "Once we have Mason's family, he'll have no choice but to let us ride out," Jedediah assured his wounded brother. "Porter won't fail." Isaac winced as Patrick O'Malley bandaged his injured hand. "And if Porter doesn't come back?" "He will." Jedediah peered out the saloon window at the gathering of armed townspeople surrounding the building. "He's never failed me before." Sean O'Malley, his face and arms bandaged from the burns caused by the exploding lantern, looked less convinced. "Mason isn't like other men we've faced, Jed. Neither is this town." Jedediah waved away his concerns. "Every man has a weakness. Mason's is his family. Once Porter brings them in, we'll—" He broke off as hoofbeats sounded outside. From his position, by the window, Jedediah could see a rider approaching slowly down the main street, silhouetted against the pre-dawn light. "It's Porter," he announced with satisfaction. Then his expression changed to confusion. "But he's alone." As the rider drew closer, Jedediah could see that it was indeed Porter, but with his hands bound to his saddle horn and Thomas Mason walking. Beside the horse, the Springfield rifle aimed steady and true. The first light of dawn painted Willow Creek's buildings in shades of gold and amber as Thomas Mason marched Clayton Porter down Main Street. Sheriff Wilson and his makeshift posse watched in stunned silence from their positions around the saloon. No one had expected Mason to return with a prisoner rather than as a grieving, vengeful father. "Mason," Wilson called out, "what happened at your farm?" "My family's safe," Mason replied without breaking stride. "Porter here had a change of heart." Porter sat stiffly in the saddle, his expression unreadable as Mason guided the horse toward the saloon. The tracker's eyes met Jedediah's through the dusty window, communicating something that only the outlaw leader could decipher. As they neared the saloon, Mason stopped, positioning himself and Porter in plain view of anyone inside. "Blackwell!" he shouted. "Come out and talk! Just you!" For a long moment nothing happened. Then the batwing doors creaked open, and Jedediah Blackwell stepped onto the porch, his revolver holstered in a gesture of temporary truce. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon, Mason," Jedediah called, his eyes fixed on Porter. "And certainly not with my man." "We had a productive conversation," Mason replied evenly. "Porter has something to say to you." Jedediah's expression hardened. "Porter doesn't speak for me." "Hear me out, Jed," Porter said, his bound hands limiting his gestures. "Mason's offering terms." "I don't negotiate with farmers," Jedediah sneered. But there was uncertainty beneath his bravado. The morning light revealed the full extent of their predicament. Townsmen with rifles on rooftops, the sheriff's posse closing in, and Mason himself, whose reputation as a marksman had already been amply demonstrated. "Then perhaps you'll negotiate." "With 3 Mile Mason of the 5th Infantry," Mason responded, his voice carrying clearly in the morning stillness. "The man who held Broken Ridge against 30 Sioux, the man who could put a bullet through your eye before you clear leather." A murmur ran through the gathering crowd. Many of the townspeople had never known the full extent of their quiet neighbor's military background. Jedediah's jaw tightened. "Say your piece." "It's simple," Mason said. "You and your men surrender your weapons and submit to arrest. In return, I guarantee you'll reach the territorial court alive for a fair trial." "And if we don't?" Mason's expression didn't change, but his voice dropped to a dangerous softness that nonetheless carried to every ear. "Then none of you leaves Willow Creek breathing." Jedediah barked a laugh, though it sounded forced. "Bold words from one man who's already wounded 3 of your gang without taking a scratch himself," Sheriff Wilson interjected. "One man who could have killed any of you at any time during the night, but chose not to." "It's over, Jed," Porter added quietly. "Mason's wife had the drop on me before I even knew she was armed. Their boy too. This isn't a family you want to cross." Jedediah's eyes narrowed. "Are you going soft on me, Porter?" "I'm trying to keep you alive," Porter replied. "There's no percentage in dying here." A tense silence fell over the street as Jedediah weighed his options. Inside the saloon, Isaac and the O'Malley brothers waited for his decision, their futures hanging in the balance. "What kind of trial are you promising?" Jedediah finally asked. "We've killed people, Mason. Shoot up your town." "Justice, not vengeance," Mason answered. "I served with Judge Parker in the war. He's a hard man, but a fair one." Jedediah's gaze shifted from Mason to Porter, then to the townspeople surrounding the saloon. His shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly as the fight drained out of him. "Isaac's not going to like this." As if on cue, a shot rang out from inside the saloon, splintering the wood of the porch near Mason's feet. Isaac's voice followed, slurred, with pain and whiskey. "No deals, Jed. We shoot our way out or die trying." The street erupted into chaos. Jedediah dove back through the batwing doors as Mason pulled Porter from the saddle, both men taking cover behind a water trough as bullets whizzed overhead. "So much for negotiation," Porter muttered. Mason cut the ropes binding Porter's hands. "Your chance to choose sides, Porter. What's it going to be?" Porter rubbed his wrists, looking from Mason to the saloon where his friends were making what would likely be their last stand. "Jed saved my life once, in Colorado." And now you can save him, Mason countered, by helping end this before anyone else dies. Another volley of shots peppered the street as Isaac's wild firing continued. From inside the saloon came the sound of breaking glass and shouting, "Jedediah!" Trying to regain control of his increasingly desperate gang, Porter made his decision. "What do you need me to do?" Mason handed Porter his revolver, but first, "Get inside, talk sense into Jedediah, make him understand there's no way out except surrender." Porter checked the weapons chamber, finding it fully loaded, a gesture of trust that wasn't lost on him. "And if I can't convince him, then get clear of the building," Mason said grimly, "because I won't be able to hold back the townspeople much longer." Porter nodded once, then crouched low and sprinted toward the rear of the saloon, using the early morning shadows for cover. Sheriff Wilson crawled to Mason's position behind the water trough. "Do you trust him?" "Enough," Mason replied. Porter's a man with a code, misguided loyalty, but a code nonetheless. And if he betrays that trust, Mason's expression hardened, then he dies with the rest of them. Inside the saloon, chaos reigned. Isaac Blackwell, drunk on whiskey and pain, fired wildly through windows and doors. Patrick O'Malley had taken up position behind the bar, while his brother Sean lay on a makeshift pallet, his burns making him feverish and delirious. Jedediah tried desperately to restore order. "Isaac, stop wasting ammunition. We need to think this through." "Think what through?" Isaac snarled, breaking another window with his gun barrel before firing at movement outside. "How are we going to hang?" "No thanks, brother. Better the hangman's noose than Mason's bullet," Jedediah argued. "At least we'd have time to—" He broke off as a floorboard creaked behind them. Both brothers whirled, guns raised, to find Porter emerging from the back room. "Damn it, Porter!" Jedediah lowered his weapon. "I thought you were dead or captured, both, for a while." Porter surveyed the room, taking in the desperate situation. "Mason cut me loose." Isaac's bloodshot eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Why would he do that?" "Because I convinced him I could talk sense into you," Porter replied, his gaze steady on Jedediah. "It's over, Jed. Mason's offering a fair trial. It's more than we deserve after all this." "He sent you to persuade us to surrender?" Isaac laughed bitterly. "After what we tried to do to his family. He sent me because he knows I care whether you live or die," Porter said quietly. "The townspeople are ready to burn this place down. Around our ears. Mason's the only thing holding them back." Patrick emerged from behind the bar, his expression troubled. "Sean needs a doctor, Jed. He's getting worse." Jedediah moved to the window, peering cautiously through the broken glass. The street was filled with armed townspeople, and somewhere on the rooftops, Mason would be watching, rifle ready. "Even if we wanted to surrender," Jedediah said slowly, "how do we know they won't shoot us the moment we step outside?" "Because Mason gave me his word," Porter replied, "and from what I've learned of him, that means something." Isaac spat on the floor. "The word of a farmer." "The word of a soldier," Porter corrected. "A man who could have killed any of us 10 times over last night, but chose not to." Jedediah turned from the window, his face haggard in the morning light, outfiltering through the shutters. For the first time since Porter had known him, the outlaw leader looked his age, and more. "We've had a good run, haven't we?" Jedediah said softly, almost to himself. Porter nodded, hoping that his friend was finally seeing reason. 8 years, longer than most. Longer than we deserved, maybe. Jedediah glanced at his wounded brother, then at Sean O'Malley's feverish form on the floor. "What kind of terms are we talking about?" "We surrender our weapons, submit to arrest," Porter explained. "Mason guarantees we reach the territorial court alive for a fair trial." "And what does that get us? 20 years in prison? The gallows?" Isaac demanded. "It gets you alive, for starters," Porter countered. "And the judge here knows Mason from the war. If Mason speaks for us—" Isaac raised his gun suddenly, pointing it at Porter. "You've gone yellow, Porter. Mason's gotten to you. Somehow." "Isaac," Jedediah warned, "put it down. He's working for them now." Isaac's hand shook, whether from rage or the pain of his earlier wound. It was hard to tell. Probably led them right to us. Porter held his ground, making no move toward the revolver Mason had returned to him. "You're not thinking straight, Isaac. None of us are getting out of this town alive, unless we deal." For a tense moment, the only sound was Sean's labored breathing from his pallet on the floor. Then, slowly, Isaac lowered his weapon. "Jed?" he asked, turning to his brother. "What do we do?" Jedediah Blackwell, who had spent a lifetime making split-second decisions that kept him one step ahead of the law, took a deep breath and made what might be his last. "We surrender." Outside, Mason watched from his position on the roof of the Mercantile as the saloon's front doors swung open. First came Porter, his hands raised high and visible. Behind him, Jedediah Blackwell emerged. Then Patrick O'Malley supported Sean's semi-conscious form. Finally, Isaac appeared, his expression defiant even in defeat. One by one, they tossed their weapons into the street. "Sheriff Wilson," Jedediah called, his voice steady. "We're surrendering on the terms offered by Mason." Wilson stepped forward, motioning for his deputy to collect the discarded weapons. "Wise decision, Blackwell." As the townspeople moved in to secure the prisoners, Mason descended from his rooftop perch. The morning sun now fully illuminated the street, revealing the damage from the night's conflict: broken windows, bullet-scarred buildings, bloodstains on the boardwalks. Judge Parker approached as Mason reached the ground. "Quite a night's work." "Thomas," Mason shouldered his rifle. "Not how I plan to spend it." "No, I imagine not." The judge watched as Collins handcuffed the outlaws. "Your old reputation seems to have preceded you. 3 Mile Mason, is it?" "A name I thought I'd left behind," Mason replied quietly. "Along with the man who earned it." Parker studied his neighbor with newfound respect. "Sometimes the past has a way of finding us, whether we want it to or not." He nodded toward the prisoners. "You really think they deserve a fair trial after what they tried to do?" "Everyone deserves justice," Mason said, "even men like Blackwell." As the outlaws were led toward the jailhouse, Porter caught Mason's eye and nodded once, a gesture of grudging respect between men who, in different circumstances, might have found common ground. Mason returned the nod, then turned toward home. Emma and the children would be waiting, and there were morning chores to be done. The corn wouldn't plant itself, and the ancient shotgun needed cleaning after its night in William's inexperienced hands. The legend of 3 Mile Mason could go back to sleep for a while longer. Thomas Mason, farmer, had work to do. By noon, Willow Creek had begun to recover from the night's chaos. Storekeepers swept broken glass from boardwalks, carpenters hammered fresh planks over bullet holes, and the town doctor tended to those with minor injuries. The more seriously wounded, Sean O'Malley among them, had been moved to the back room of Dr. Elliott's office, where the smell of carbolic acid and whiskey hung heavy in the air. Inside the jailhouse, Sheriff Wilson and Deputy Collins had their hands full. The town's 2 small cells now held 4 prisoners, Jedediah and Isaac Blackwell sharing one, Patrick O'Malley and Clayton Porter the other. Sean remained under Dr. Elliott's care, handcuffed to his bed despite his condition. Judge Parker sat behind the sheriff's desk, reviewing the charges that would be presented at the preliminary hearing. Armed robbery, attempted murder, criminal conspiracy, assault on a peace officer. The list went on, page after page of offenses that spanned multiple territories. Wilson leaned against the doorframe, watching the prisoners. "Think any of these charges will stick in territorial court? With the evidence we have?" Parker nodded grimly. "They'll hang for sure, especially with other jurisdictions filing their own charges." Wilson lowered his voice. "What about Mason's promise of a fair trial?" "Fair doesn't mean lenient," Parker replied, though a troubled expression crossed his weathered face. "But I'll honor his word. No lynch mobs, no frontier justice. They'll get their day in court." In the first cell, Jedediah Blackwell listened to this exchange with resigned acceptance. He'd known the risks when he chose the outlaw's path. Now, sitting on a narrow cot beside his brooding brother, he found himself thinking not of escape, but of the strange twist of fate that had brought them to this end. "Of all the towns in all the territories," he murmured, "we had to ride into one, with Thomas Mason." Isaac scowled, cradling his bandaged hand. "We could have taken him if we'd known who he was from the start." "No," Jedediah shook his head. "Men like Mason don't go down easy. I heard stories about him during the Sioux campaigns. They said he could hit a playing card at 1,000 yards. Then why's he living as a dirt farmer?" Isaac demanded. "Man with skills like that could be working for Pinkerton, making real money." From the other cell, Porter spoke up. "Some men want more than money." "Like what?" Isaac sneered. "The joy of growing corn?" "Peace," Porter said simply. "The kind men like us never find." The jailhouse door opened, and Thomas Mason himself stepped. Inside, still carrying the Springfield rifle that had been his constant companion throughout the night. He'd exchanged few words with anyone after the surrender, returning home briefly to check on his family before heading back to town. Sheriff Wilson straightened up. "Thomas, didn't expect to see you back so soon," Emma insisted. A hint of a smile touched Mason's lips. "Said the corn could wait a day, but justice couldn't." Judge Parker rose from behind the desk, extending his hand. "The town owes you a debt, Mason. Without your intervention, this could have ended much worse." Mason shook the offered hand, then glanced toward the cells. "I'd like a word with Blackwell, alone." Wilson hesitated, then nodded. "Come on, Judge, let's get some coffee." He unlocked the cell containing Jedediah and Isaac. "You," he pointed at Isaac, "out here for a bit." Once the others had left, closing the door behind them, Mason took a seat on the vacant cot opposite Jedediah. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Jedediah broke the silence. "Come to gloat, Mason?" "No." Mason set his rifle aside, leaning it against the wall. "I came to understand." Jedediah raised an eyebrow. "Understand what?" "Why would a man, with your experience, make such a basic mistake?" Mason said. "Attacking a town without proper reconnaissance, underestimating your opposition. It's not like the Jedediah Blackwell I've heard about." A bitter laugh escaped Jedediah's lips. "Maybe I'm getting old, or careless." He studied Mason thoughtfully. "Though in fairness, who'd expect to find a legend like 3 Mile Mason playing at being a farmer in a backwater like this?" "I don't play at being a farmer," Mason corrected him. "I am one." "Now, maybe." Jedediah leaned forward, eyes intent. "But men like us don't change their nature, Mason. You can bury it under acres of corn and family responsibility, but the killer instinct never truly dies." Mason's expression remained impassive. "Is that what you tell yourself to justify your choices?" "I don't need justification." Jedediah settled back against the cell wall. "I am what I am. So are you. The only difference is I don't pretend otherwise." A thoughtful silence fell between them. Outside the jailhouse window, life in Willow Creek continued. Voices calling, hammers ringing, wagons creaking. The ordinary sounds of a town returning to normal after brushing against extraordinary danger. "Your man, Porter," Mason said finally. "He's different from the others." "Porter's a tracker, not a killer," Jedediah acknowledged. "Never comfortable with the rougher parts of our business, but loyal to a fault. He could get a lighter sentence if he cooperates with the prosecution." Jedediah's eyes hardened. "Is that why you're here, to turn my men against me?" "I'm here because I gave my word that you'd get a fair trial," Mason replied evenly. "That includes the chance to speak for yourself and your men before judgment is passed." "And you think that makes a difference?" Skepticism dripped from Jedediah's words. "We both know how this ends." Mason retrieved his rifle and stood. Nothing's certain until it happens, Blackwell. Something a gambler like you should appreciate. As Mason moved toward the door, Jedediah called after him. One question, Mason. When the farmer turned back, Jedediah continued, Why did you leave it all behind? The reputation, the respect for this. He gestured dismissively at the world beyond the jail walls. Mason considered the question carefully before answering. I killed 37 men that I know of during the Sioux campaigns, not in the heat of battle, but cold, calculating distance, wind, the curvature of the earth. I'd watch through my scope as they fell, one after another. His voice remained steady, but something haunted flickered behind his eyes. The 38th would have been a boy, no more than 14, carrying messages between Sioux camps. I had him in my sights for almost a minute before I lowered my rifle and walked away. You couldn't pull the trigger, Jedediah surmised. I could have, Mason corrected him. That was the problem. Even knowing he was just a boy, I could have done it without hesitation. That's when I realized what I was becoming, what I'd already become. He met Jedediah's gaze directly. Some prices are too high, even for a legend. With that, Mason exited the cell, leaving Jedediah Blackwell alone, with thoughts more troubling than the prospect of the gallows. The Mason farm was unusually busy that afternoon. Word of Thomas's role in thwarting the Blackwater gang had spread rapidly, and neighbors who had previously kept a polite distance now arrived with food, offers of help with chores, and thinly disguised curiosity about the quiet farmer's hidden past. Emma handled the visitors with practiced grace, accepting casseroles and deflecting questions with equal skill. Only when Nancy Wilkerson from the neighboring farm arrived did she allow herself a moment of unguarded conversation on the porch, away from the others. I always knew there was more to your Thomas than he let on, Nancy said, rocking gently in the chair Emma had offered. A man doesn't have those kinds of eyes from just ploughing fields. Emma's smile was tinged with sadness. He wanted so badly to leave it all behind. Some ghosts follow a person, Nancy observed, no matter how far they run. Inside the house, William sat at the kitchen table, carefully cleaning the ancient shotgun under the watchful eye of his little sister Sarah. The boy worked with solemn concentration, applying oil to the mechanism just as his father had taught him. Will Pa let me shoot it when I'm bigger? Sarah asked, standing on tiptoes to see better. Maybe, William replied, though doubt crept into his voice. Pa doesn't like guns much, though. But he's the best shot ever, Sarah protested with a child's logic. Everyone says so. William continued his task in silence, considering this contradiction. Finally he said, I think that's why he doesn't like them, Sarah. Because he knows what they can do. The afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the golden light. In that peaceful moment, it seemed impossible that just hours earlier, this same shotgun had been pointed at an intruder with deadly intent. Sarah lost interest in the gun and wandered to the window. Pa's coming, she announced, pressing her nose against the glass. William hastily finished reassembling the shotgun and placed it carefully in its usual spot by the door, just as Thomas Mason's tall figure appeared in the doorway. Pa! Sarah launched herself at her father, who caught her with a weary smile. Did you put the bad men in jail? I did, Mason confirmed, lifting her high. And they'll stay there for a good long while. William hung back, watching his father with new eyes. Since dawn, he'd heard whispered conversations, caught fragments of stories about his father's past, stories that painted a very different picture than the patient farmer he'd known all his life. Mason set Sarah down and turned to his son, noting the boy's careful scrutiny. The shotgun looks good, he said, nodding toward the weapon. You did a fine job cleaning it. Mr. Wilkerson says you were the best shot in the whole army, William blurted out, that you could hit a target no one else could even see. Mason's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Mr. Wilkerson talks too much. Is it true? William persisted. Before Mason could answer, Emma appeared in the doorway. That's enough questions for now, William. Your father's had a long night and day. She crossed to Mason's side, placing a hand on his arm. Judge Parker sent word. The preliminary hearing is set for tomorrow. Mason nodded, the tension in his shoulders visible only to his wife's knowing eyes. I should be there. You don't have to be, Emma said softly. You've done your part. I gave my word, Mason replied, the simple statement carrying the weight of an immovable principle. Later that evening, after the children were in bed, Mason and Emma sat on the porch, watching as fireflies began to appear in the gathering dusk. The peaceful scene belied the turmoil Mason felt within. The town sees me differently now, he said finally. I can feel it in the way they look at me. Emma's hand found him in the darkness. Does it matter? It might, Mason admitted. We came here to start fresh, to raise our children somewhere they wouldn't have to live with my reputation. And we have, Emma reminded him. 5 good years where William and Sarah have known their father as a farmer, not a soldier. That doesn't change because of one night. Mason wasn't convinced. Porter said something that's been troubling me. He said men like Blackwell and me don't change our nature. And what do you think? Mason was silent for a long moment, considering. I think, he began slowly, that nature and choice are different things. A wolf is still a wolf, even if it chooses not to hunt. Emma squeezed his hand. You're not a wolf, Thomas. You're a man who made difficult choices in difficult times. And now I face another one, Mason said quietly. The prosecution will want me to testify about last night, about Blackwell and his men. Will you? Mason stared out at the darkening fields, where next season's crops would soon grow. I'm not sure my testimony would help their case. Emma looked at him curiously. What do you mean? I saw something in Blackwell, Mason explained. Something I recognized. A man at the end of his rope, making one last desperate gamble. He shook his head. It doesn't excuse what they did, but you understand it, Emma finished for him. More than I should. They sat in companionable silence as the last light faded from the sky. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, the hearing, the town's continued scrutiny, the delicate balance of honoring his word while protecting his family's future. For tonight, however, Thomas Mason was simply grateful to be home with the worst of the danger behind them. Yet even as he took comfort in Emma's presence beside him, a nagging feeling persisted, the sense that the confrontation with Jedediah Blackwell was not truly over, but merely entering a different phase. Some battles, Mason knew all too well, continued long after the last shot was fired. The Willow Creek Courthouse was actually the second floor of the town hall, a modest building that served multiple functions for the small community. On the morning of the preliminary hearing, it seemed as though every resident of Willow Creek and the surrounding farms had crowded into the space, eager to witness justice being served to the infamous Blackwater gang. Judge Franklin Parker, dressed in his formal black robes, sat behind a heavy oak desk that served as the bench. Though technically retired from the territorial circuit, Parker had been Willow Creek's only judicial authority for the past 8 years. His reputation for fairness was matched only by his intolerance for courtroom disruptions. This hearing will come to order, Parker announced, silencing the murmuring crowd with a sharp rap of his gavel. Sheriff Wilson, bring in the prisoners. The side door opened, and Sheriff Wilson led in the 5 members of the Blackwater gang. Jedediah Blackwell walked with his characteristic swagger intact despite his shackles. Behind him came Isaac, his bandaged hand held stiffly at his side, followed by Patrick O'Malley. Clayton Porter was next, his expression somber but composed. Last came Sean O'Malley, supported by Dr. Elliot, his burned face partially covered with bandages. The crowd's reaction was immediate, a wave of whispers and hostile glares that made Sheriff Wilson thankful for the dozen armed men stationed around. The courtroom. As the prisoners were seated in a row before the judge, Thomas Mason slipped quietly into the courtroom, taking a position at the back where he could observe without drawing attention. He had debated whether to attend at all, torn between his promise to ensure a fair trial and his desire to return to the anonymity of his farm life. In the end, the former had won out, though he'd asked Emma and the children to remain at home. Judge. Parker cleared his throat. Jedediah Blackwell, Isaac Blackwell, Patrick O'Malley, Sean O'Malley, and Clayton Porter, you stand accused of multiple serious offenses against the people and property of Willow Creek. How do you plead? Before any of the accused could respond, the courtroom door opened again, and a tall, distinguished man in an expensive suit entered, carrying a leather document case. Frederick Sullivan, Your Honor, the newcomer announced, approaching the bench. Attorney for the defendants. A surprised murmur ran through the courtroom. No one had expected the outlaws to have legal representation, especially not someone of Sullivan's obvious sophistication. Judge Parker raised an eyebrow. I wasn't aware the defendants had secured counsel, Mr. Sullivan. A recent arrangement. Your Honor, Sullivan replied smoothly. I was retained by interested parties in Council Bluffs who prefer to remain anonymous. From his position at the back, Mason studied the attorney with interest. Sullivan was clearly no country lawyer. His tailored suit and confident demeanor spoke of big city courtrooms and wealthy clients. Someone had gone to considerable expense to ensure the Blackwater gang had professional representation. Very well, Parker said, recovering quickly from his surprise. As this is merely a preliminary hearing to determine if sufficient evidence exists to proceed to trial, we'll dispense with formalities. Mr. Sullivan, your clients, please. Sullivan conferred briefly with the defendants before turning back to the judge. Not guilty on all counts, Your Honor. The expected outburst from the crowd was quickly silenced by Parker's gavel. Order! This is a court of law, not a town meeting. He turned to the temporary prosecutor, a young lawyer named Edward Hayes, who normally handled land disputes and wills. Mr. Hayes, you may present the charges. Hayes nervously shuffled his papers. Your Honor, the territorial government charges these 5 men with conspiracy to commit robbery, attempted bank robbery, assault upon law enforcement officers, destruction of property, and... He paused, glancing toward Mason before continuing. Attempted kidnapping and threatening of civilians. Sullivan smiled thinly. Your Honor, while my clients acknowledge their presence in Willow Creek during the unfortunate events of 2 nights ago, we contend that the evidence against them is circumstantial at best. No actual robbery occurred. No citizen was injured by their direct action. Tell that to my windows. Howard the bartender muttered loudly enough to draw chuckles from the crowd. Parker silenced them with a stern look before addressing Sullivan. Attempted crimes are still crimes, Counselor, and we have numerous witnesses to your client's actions. Witnesses operating in darkness and confusion, Your Honor, Sullivan countered. I would like to call Mr. Thomas Mason to testify regarding what he actually observed. A hush fell over the courtroom as all eyes turned to Mason. He had expected to be called eventually, but was surprised by the defense attorney's eagerness to hear his account. Judge Parker nodded. Mr. Mason, please come forward and be sworn in. Mason made his way to the witness stand, aware of the scrutiny from both the townsfolk and the defendants. After being sworn in, he settled into the chair, his posture naturally straight despite his farmer's clothes. Sullivan approached, his manner respectful but calculating. Mr. Mason, it seems you played a pivotal role in the events of 2 nights ago. Would you describe for the court what you personally witnessed regarding my client's actions? Mason considered carefully before answering. I observed 5 men riding into town shortly before sundown, Later that evening, I witnessed them attempting to gain entry to the bank through the rear door. And did you see them actually enter the bank or remove any money or valuables? No. I fired warning shots to prevent the robbery. Sullivan nodded, as if this confirmed something important. So the robbery was prevented before it occurred. What happened next? There was an exchange of gunfire. Your clients took cover in various locations around town before eventually retreating to the saloon. And during this exchange of gunfire, did you personally see any of my clients shoot or injure any townsperson? Mason frowned slightly. Not directly, no. Most of the injuries occurred in the confusion. Sullivan paced before the witness stand. Mr. Mason, the charges include attempted kidnapping. This refers, I believe, to Mr. Porter's visit to your farm. Yet Mr. Porter never actually took any of your family members, did he? He intended to, Mason replied evenly. He admitted as much. But he didn't follow through with this alleged plan, Sullivan pressed. In fact, according to Sheriff Wilson's report, Mr. Porter actively helped convince his companions to surrender peacefully. Is that correct? It is. Sullivan turned to face the judge. So we have attempted crimes that never materialized, and a defendant who ultimately assisted law enforcement. Hardly the actions of a hardened criminal gang, Your Honor. Hayes jumped to his feet. Objection! Counsel is testifying, not questioning the witness. Sustained, Parker ruled. Mr. Sullivan, confine yourself to questions for the witness. Sullivan nodded apologetically. Mr. Mason, rumor has it you have some military experience. Would you elaborate on that for the court? Mason tensed almost imperceptibly. I served in the 5th Infantry during the Sioux campaigns, and gained quite a reputation as a marksman, I understand. Sullivan smiled. In fact, you were known as 3 Mile Mason, were you not? That was a nickname, yes. A nickname earned through your exceptional skill with a rifle, a skill that would have allowed you to eliminate any genuine threat with lethal efficiency. Sullivan's voice remained conversational, yet you chose to fire warning shots rather than kill the men you claim were dangerous criminals. Why is that, Mr. Mason? Mason met the attorney's gaze steadily. I don't kill unless there's no alternative. Even when confronted with what you believed to be deadly threats to your town and family. Sullivan raised an eyebrow. That suggests you didn't actually perceive my clients as the dangerous criminals the prosecution portrays them to be. Hayes stood again. Objection. Counsel is putting words in the witness's mouth. I'll rephrase, Sullivan said smoothly. Mr. Mason, based on your military experience, did you consider the defendants to be presenting a lethal threat that night? Mason glanced toward the defendants. Jedediah Blackwell watched him with an unreadable expression, while Isaac glared. Openly, Porter's eyes held a question, perhaps even a plea. They were armed and desperate, Mason said carefully. That's always dangerous. But I believed they could be persuaded to surrender without bloodshed. Sullivan nodded, satisfied. One final question, Mr. Mason. Did you personally witness Jedediah Blackwell or any of his companions explicitly threaten to rob the bank or harm any citizen of Willow Creek? Mason hesitated. In truth, he hadn't heard any such explicit threat. He'd acted on Porter's information and his own assessment of the situation. No, he finally admitted. I did not personally hear such threats. Thank you, Mr. Mason. Sullivan turned to the judge. No further questions, Your Honor. Hayes approached for cross-examination, his youthful face flushed with anxiety. Mr. Mason, despite not hearing explicit threats, did you have reason to believe the defendants intended to rob the bank and harm citizens? I did, Mason confirmed. Porter told me as much when I captured him at my farm. And did you observe the defendants firing weapons in town? Yes, multiple times. And these shots endangered townspeople? They did. Hayes seemed to gain confidence. In your expert opinion as a former military marksman, were the defendant's actions consistent with men planning to commit robbery and potentially other violent crimes? Objection, Sullivan interjected. Calls for speculation. Overruled, Parker said. The witness has established expertise in assessing tactical situations. He may answer. Mason nodded. Their movements and positioning were consistent with men preparing to rob the bank. The nighttime approach, the attempt to access the rear door, the distribution of men to cover different angles. These are the actions of men planning a robbery. Hayes straightened slightly. No further questions, Your Honor? As Mason returned to his seat, he noticed Sullivan conferring urgently with Jedediah. Whatever the attorney was proposing, Jedediah seemed resistant at first, then reluctantly nodded. Judge Parker called the next witness, Deputy Collins, who recounted his observations during the night with youthful enthusiasm but limited coherence. Sullivan's cross-examination was brief and focused on highlighting inconsistencies in the deputy's recollection. Similar testimonies followed from Howard the bartender, Dr. Elliott, and several townspeople who had witnessed portions of the conflict. Sullivan skillfully challenged each account, emphasizing the darkness, confusion, and limited visibility that prevailed during much of the confrontation. By mid-afternoon, the hearing had developed a rhythm, prosecution witnesses describing acts of aggression by the Blackwater gang, followed by Sullivan's meticulous efforts to introduce doubt and alternative interpretations. Then came the surprise that Mason had begun to anticipate. Sullivan stood and addressed the judge. Your Honor, the defense calls Clayton Porter to testify on behalf of his co-defendants. The courtroom erupted in shocked whispers. Porter himself looked startled, though less so than his companions. Isaac. Blackwell half rose from his seat, only to be restrained by Sheriff Wilson. You yellow-bellied traitor! Isaac snarled as Porter was escorted to the witness stand. Order! Parker banged his gavel repeatedly until quiet was restored. Mr. Porter, you understand that by testifying you may be incriminating yourself? Porter nodded solemnly. I do, Your Honor. After Porter was sworn in, Sullivan approached his witness with calculated precision. Mr. Porter, please tell the court about your association with Jedediah Blackwell and the events that brought you to Willow Creek. Porter cleared his throat, avoiding eye contact with his former companions. I've ridden with Jed, with Mr. Blackwell, for nearly 8 years as a scout and tracker. 2 days ago we arrived in Willow Creek, intending to rest our horses before continuing north. At that time, was there any plan to rob the town bank? Porter hesitated, then answered carefully. Not initially, no. The decision came later, after. Isaac had a run-in with Mason at the saloon. Sullivan nodded encouragingly. Please elaborate on that incident and what followed. As Porter began recounting the events from his perspective, Mason listened with growing concern. The tracker was treading a delicate line, technically telling the truth while framing events in the most favorable light possible for the defendants. Bet's testimony painted Jedediah as reluctant to engage in violence, Isaac as an impulsive hothead acting against his brother's wishes, and the O'Malley brothers as simply following orders. Porter himself emerged as a voice of reason who had ultimately helped prevent bloodshed. When Sullivan finished his questioning, Hayes approached Porter with visible frustration. Mr. Porter, isn't it true that you've participated in numerous robberies with these men before coming to Willow Creek? Objection, Sullivan interrupted. Prior alleged crimes are not at issue in this hearing. Sustained, Parker ruled. Confine your questions to the events in Willow Creek, Mr. Hayes. The young prosecutor regrouped. Mr. Porter, you testified that there was no initial plan to rob the bank, yet you and your companions were armed and had a history of working together. Why were you really in Willow Creek? Porter met the prosecutor's gaze steadily. We were passing through, heading north to Montana Territory. Willow Creek seemed like a quiet place to resupply. And the attempted bank robbery, that just happened spontaneously? Things escalated, Porter admitted. After the confrontation at the saloon, tensions were high. Isaac was angry about Mason humiliating him. One thing led to another. Hayes pressed harder. You expect this court to believe that 5 notorious outlaws just happened to decide to rob a bank on the spur of the moment? Objection, Sullivan barked. Prejudicial characterization of the defendants. Sustained, Parker said wearily. Rephrase, Mr. Hayes. But the damage had been done. Porter's testimony had introduced doubt, suggesting impulsive poor judgment rather than premeditated criminal intent. As the hearing continued, Mason found himself torn. His natural sense of justice wanted the Blackwater gang held accountable for the terror they had brought to Willow Creek. Yet Porter's testimony, while selective, wasn't entirely false. The confrontation had indeed escalated from a simple encounter into something far more dangerous, and Mason's own actions had contributed to that escalation. The sun was low in the sky when Judge Parker finally called for concluding statements. Hayes went first, his youthful earnestness making up for his lack of experience as he summarized the evidence against the defendants. Then Sullivan rose, his commanding presence drawing all eyes. Your Honor, while my client's actions may have been foolish and reckless, the evidence presented today falls far short of establishing criminal intent beyond reasonable doubt. At most, we have misdemeanors, disturbing the peace, property damage, discharging firearms within town limits. I respectfully submit that the more serious charges should be dismissed. Judge Parker removed his spectacles and pinched the bridge of his nose, considering. The courtroom waited in tense silence for his decision. I'm ready to rule on which charges will proceed to trial, Parker announced finally. This hearing stands in recess for 1 hour, after which I will deliver my decision. As the courtroom emptied, Mason found himself standing face to face with Frederick Sullivan in the narrow hallway. Mr. Mason, the attorney acknowledged with a respectful nod. Your testimony was most illuminating, was it? Mason kept his expression neutral. I simply told the truth as I saw it. Sullivan smiled thinly. The truth is always more complex than it first appears, isn't it? Much like yourself. He leaned slightly closer. My anonymous client has a proposition for you. One that might benefit everyone involved. Mason's eyes narrowed. Who exactly is your client, Mr. Sullivan? Someone who believes that men of exceptional talent shouldn't waste their gifts behind a plow. Sullivan handed Mason a sealed envelope. Consider it carefully before the judge returns with his decision. As Sullivan walked away, Mason stared at the envelope in his hand, a sense of foreboding settling over him like a shadow. Thomas Mason sat alone on a bench outside the courthouse, turning the sealed envelope over in his hands. The paper was expensive, the wax seal bearing an emblem he didn't recognize. Whatever proposition lay inside, it had been prepared with care and forethought, not a hasty attempt to influence his actions, but something planned well in advance. The courthouse had emptied as people dispersed to nearby establishments for refreshment before the judge's ruling. Mason had declined several invitations to join groups of admiring townspeople, preferring solitude as he contemplated the mysterious envelope and what it might contain. With a decisive motion, he broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was elegant, the ink still fresh enough to suggest it had been written after his testimony. Mr. Mason, your reputation precedes you, though your current circumstances do not reflect your exceptional talents. The Sweetwater Mining Corporation needs a man with your particular skills. Recent incidents involving theft of gold shipments and threats to our personnel require someone who can provide security with discretion and, when necessary, decisive action from a distance. We offer a starting salary of $500 per month, housing for your family in Virginia City, and education for your children at the finest school in the territory. Mr. Sullivan is authorized to negotiate terms should you express interest. This offer remains open regardless of Judge Parker's ruling in the current case. However, should you choose to use your influence toward a more lenient outcome for Mr. Blackwell and his associates, an additional consideration of $1,000 would be made available immediately upon your acceptance of the position. A man of your abilities deserves better than burying his gifts behind a plow. Consider carefully where your true value lies. Respectfully, Jonathan Prescott, Director of Operations, Sweetwater Mining Corporation. Mason read the letter twice, his expression hardening. With each paragraph, the offer itself wasn't surprising. His military reputation had occasionally attracted similar propositions over the years, all of which he had declined. But the timing and the implied bribe to influence the legal proceedings against Blackwell suggested connections he hadn't anticipated. The sound of approaching footsteps drew his attention. Sheriff Wilson walked toward him, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. "Thought you might need this," Wilson said, offering one of the mugs as he sat beside Mason. "Judge Parker takes his time with these decisions." Mason accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks, discreetly folding the letter and returning it to the envelope. Wilson gestured toward the envelope. "Bad news?" "A job offer," Mason replied, "from the Sweetwater Mining Corporation." Wilson's eyebrows rose. "That's Jonathan Prescott's outfit. Big operation. Gold mines all through the northern territories. They've been expanding aggressively." "You know Prescott?" "Only by reputation." Wilson sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Hard businessman. Gets what he wants, one way or another." Mason turned the envelope over in his hands. "And sometimes what he wants is to influence legal proceedings." Wilson's eyes narrowed. "They're trying to buy you off? To do what exactly?" "Use my influence to secure leniency for Blackwell and his gang." Mason handed the letter to Wilson. "In exchange for a job and a substantial bonus." The sheriff scanned the contents, his expression darkening. "This is bribery, plain and simple. We should show this to Parker." "Not yet." Mason took back the letter. "First, I want to understand why a mining corporation would intervene on behalf of outlaws like the Blackwater gang." Wilson considered this, stroking his mustache thoughtfully. "Could be they've hired Blackwell and his men in the past. Some of these mining operations use muscle to intimidate competitors or deal with labor problems. Or maybe they're planning to use them in the future," Mason suggested, "assuming they avoid serious prison time." "Either way, it's not right." Wilson set down his mug with more force than necessary. "Prescott thinks he can buy justice in Willow Creek." Mason nodded grimly. "The question is, what do we do about it?" Before Wilson could respond, the courthouse bell rang, signaling that court would reconvene in 15 minutes. People began streaming back into the building, their mood subdued yet expectant. "For now, we say nothing," Mason decided. "Let's see how Parker rules without our interference. Then we'll decide our next move." Wilson looked unconvinced but nodded in agreement. "Your call, Thomas. But if Prescott's trying to manipulate the outcome of this hearing, it won't end with that letter." The courtroom was even more crowded for the judge's ruling. Those who couldn't find seats stood along the walls, and the local newspaper editor had claimed a prime position from which to record the proceedings for posterity. Judge Parker entered, looking grave, the weight of his decision evident in the deep lines of his face. He adjusted his spectacles and surveyed the packed room before speaking. "I have reviewed the testimony and evidence presented today concerning the actions of Jedediah Blackwell, Isaac Blackwell, Patrick O'Malley, Sean O'Malley, and Clayton Porter. During the recent disturbance in our town," Parker's voice carried clearly through the hushed courtroom. "While many serious allegations have been made, This hearing's purpose is simply to determine which charges are sufficiently supported by evidence to warrant a full trial. Attorney Sullivan sat beside his clients, his expression confident. Across the aisle, young Hayes fidgeted nervously with his papers. Regarding the charge of attempted bank robbery, Parker continued, I find that while suspicious activity occurred near the bank premises, the evidence presented does not conclusively establish intent to commit robbery beyond reasonable doubt. This charge is dismissed. A murmur of discontent ran through the room. Mason, from his position at the back, watched Sullivan's satisfied nod. Regarding charges of assault upon law enforcement officers, Parker went on, sufficient evidence exists that shots were fired at Sheriff Wilson and Deputy Collins. These charges will proceed to trial. Sullivan's expression remained unchanged, as if he had anticipated this compromise. Charges of destruction of property and creating public disorder are similarly supported by eyewitness testimony and will proceed to trial. Parker removed his spectacles, polishing them as he delivered his final decisions. As for the charge of attempted kidnapping related to events at the Mason farm, the evidence is largely circumstantial and based on statements by Mr. Porter himself, who has cooperated with authorities. This charge is dismissed. Parker replaced his spectacles and fixed the defendants with a stern gaze. Let me be clear, the reduced charges still carry significant penalties under territorial law. I'm merely applying the standard of reasonable doubt appropriate to our justice system. Frederick Sullivan rose smoothly. Your Honor, given the dismissal of the most serious charges and my client's cooperation, we request the court consider reasonable bail. Parker considered this briefly. Bail is set at $500 for each defendant, to be paid in full before release. Additionally, all defendants must remain within the county until trial, which will be scheduled for 3 weeks from today. He banged his gavel. This hearing is adjourned. As the crowd dispersed, Mason moved against the flow towards Sullivan and his clients. The attorney was engaged in a hushed conversation with Jedediah, who appeared less than pleased with the outcome, despite the dismissal of the most serious charges. Mr. Sullivan, Mason interrupted. A word? Sullivan turned, his professional smile firmly in place. Mr. Mason, I hope you've had time to consider the proposition. I have, Mason replied evenly. I find myself curious about your anonymous client's interest in the Blackwater gang. Sullivan's smile remained fixed. My client's interests are varied and complex. Suffice it to say that men of talent are always valuable, whether they wield rifles or— His gaze shifted meaningfully to Jedediah. Other skills. And what skills might those be? Mason pressed. Bank robbery, intimidation, murder when necessary. You misunderstand the nature of the arrangement, Sullivan replied, his voice lowering. My client simply recognizes potential in those societies. He has deemed outlaws, much as he recognizes your own wasted potential behind a plow. Jedediah, who had been listening to this exchange with interest, finally spoke. Mason isn't interested in your client's offer, Sullivan. He's made his choice. Domesticity over excellence. Is that what you think? Mason asked, genuinely curious. I know your type, Jedediah said with surprising insight. You tell yourself you're happier living a quiet life, convincing yourself that peace is worth the sacrifice of who you really are. He glanced toward his shackled hands. At least I never lied to myself about my nature. Before Mason could respond, Sheriff Wilson approached Deputy Collins. Time to return to your accommodations, gentlemen. Court's adjourned. As the prisoners were led away, Sullivan lingered. The offer remains open, Mr. Mason. My client is not a man accustomed to hearing no. Then this will be a novel experience for him, Mason replied coolly. Inform Mr. Prescott that I'm not interested in his proposition, any aspect of it. Sullivan's composed expression flickered briefly. I don't recall mentioning Mr. Prescott's name. You didn't have to. Mason held the attorney's gaze. Give him a message from me. I may be a farmer now, but I haven't forgotten how to recognize a target. The implied threat hung in the air between them. Sullivan studied Mason's face, perhaps reassessing the man before him. I'll convey your response, he said finally, though I suspect Mr. Prescott will be disappointed. I suspect he will, Mason agreed, turning to leave. And Mr. Sullivan, I'll be watching the proceedings with great interest. Any further attempts to manipulate justice in Willow Creek might lead to unfortunate consequences. As Mason walked away, he felt Sullivan's eyes boring into his back. The confrontation had been risky. He had essentially declared himself an enemy of a powerful and unscrupulous man, but remaining silent would have been tacit acceptance of corruption, reaching even into Willow Creek's modest court of law. Outside the courthouse, Emma waited with William beside their wagon. She had evidently decided to come into town, despite Mason's request to remain at the farm. I heard the judge's ruling, she said as he approached. The serious charges were dismissed, but they'll still stand trial for the lesser offenses. Mason nodded, helping William up onto the wagon seat. It could have gone worse. Emma studied her husband's face. Something else happened. What is it? Mason glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. I'll explain at home. It seems our quiet life might be getting considerably more complicated. As they drove out of town, Mason noticed a rider observing them from the ridge overlooking the road. A stranger who made no attempt to conceal his surveillance. The message was clear. Prescott was not a man who accepted rejection gracefully. Emma followed his gaze. Trouble? Possibly, Mason admitted, but nothing we haven't handled before. William looked between his parents, sensing the tension. Is it because of what you did, Pa? Stopping those outlaws? Mason considered how to answer, wanting to be honest without frightening his son. Sometimes doing the right thing has consequences, William. That doesn't mean we should avoid doing it. The boy nodded solemnly. Like when you wouldn't shoot the Sioux boy, even though it meant leaving the army. Mason exchanged a surprised glance with Emma. How did you know about that? I heard you telling me once, William replied, when you thought I was asleep. Mason fell silent, contemplating how much of his past had already shaped his son's understanding of the world. Finally, he said, That's right. Some decisions change the course of your life completely. The trick is making sure they change it for the better. As they approached their farm, Mason took one last look at the ridge. The observer was gone, but Mason harbored no illusions that the matter was settled. Whatever game Jonathan Prescott was playing, it had only just begun, and somehow the Blackwater gang was an important piece on the board. That night, after the children were asleep, Mason cleaned and checked his Springfield rifle with meticulous care. The familiar routine steadied his hands and focused his mind, preparing him for whatever might come. Emma watched from the doorway, her expression a complex mixture of resignation and resolve. So much for our quiet life, she said softly. Mason looked up, his hands never pausing in their practiced movements. I'm sorry, Emma. I never intended to bring this kind of trouble to our door again. You didn't bring it, she corrected him. It would have found us eventually. Men like you, they don't disappear forever, no matter how deeply they bury themselves in normal life. Men like me, Mason repeated, testing the phrase. Sometimes I wonder if Blackwell was right, if I've been lying to myself all these years about who I really am. Emma crossed the room and placed a hand on his shoulder. You're exactly who you've always been, Thomas. A man who makes hard choices for the right reasons. She squeezed gently. The question isn't who you are. It's who Prescott is, and what he wants with the Blackwater gang. Mason nodded slowly. And why was he prepared to pay so handsomely to secure their freedom? Will you talk to Wilson about it tomorrow? Yes, and Judge Parker. Mason slid the cleaning rod through the rifle barrel one final time. Something larger is happening here, something that goes beyond a simple bank robbery attempt. Emma's hand moved to the back of his neck, her touch grounding him as it had countless times before. Whatever it is, we'll face it together. We always have. As she left him to his preparations, Mason assembled the rifle with practiced efficiency, each component sliding perfectly into place. Whatever storm was brewing, Thomas Mason would meet it with clear eyes and steady hands, not as the legendary marksman of his military days, but as a farmer protecting what mattered most. Night had fallen by the time Mason and Wilson approached Willow Creek. They had pushed their horses hard on the return journey, stopping only briefly to rest the animals. Both men were acutely aware that the information they carried could put their town and families in danger. "Something's wrong," Mason said suddenly, reining his horse to a stop at the crest of the ridge overlooking town. Wilson halted beside him, peering through the darkness. "Oh, what is it?" "Too many lights." Mason pointed toward Main Street, where lanterns burned in buildings that should have been dark at this hour, and riders at the edge of town. Through years of training, Mason had developed an almost uncanny ability to spot anomalies in seemingly normal situations. Now, that instinct screamed danger. "Could be nothing," Wilson suggested, though his hand moved to his holster. "Might be a town meeting or—" "No," Mason cut him off. "Look at the livery stable." The stable doors stood open, unusual for this time of night, and several unfamiliar horses were tethered outside. "We need to approach carefully," Mason decided. "Avoid the main road." They descended from the ridge using a narrow cattle path that wound through the trees, eventually bringing them to the outskirts of town, near the church. Leaving their horses tethered in the shelter of the pines, they continued on foot, using the shadows for cover. As they neared the first buildings, a familiar voice called softly from the darkness. "Sheriff, that you?" Deputy Collins emerged from behind the church, his young face tense with worry. "Thank God you're back. We've got trouble." "What kind of trouble?" Wilson asked, drawing Collins deeper into the shadows. "Strangers rode in this afternoon," Collins reported. 6 men, well armed. Their leader introduced himself as Morris, said he represents the Sweetwater Mining Corporation. Collins glanced nervously toward town. "They've taken rooms at the hotel and called an emergency town council meeting." "Morris," Mason repeated, exchanging a meaningful look with Wilson. "The same name from the telegrams." "What's this meeting about?" Wilson demanded. "Railroad negotiations, supposedly," Collins replied. "Morris claims Sweetwater can guarantee the Northern Line will come through Willow Creek if the town grants them certain land rights. Henderson's backing him completely." Mason's expression darkened. "Where's my family?" "Mrs. Mason and the children are fine," Collins assured him quickly. "Dr. Elliot invited them to stay at his house when the strangers started asking about you. Said it would be safer." Relief washed over Mason, followed quickly by cold anger. These men had been inquiring about his family while he was away, a clear message from Prescott. "Who else knows we're back?" Wilson asked. "No one," Collins confirmed. "I've been watching the ridge trail since I saw the strangers taking too much." "Interest in your whereabouts?" Mason clasped the young deputy's shoulder. "Good work. Now tell us exactly who's at this meeting and what's been said so far." Collins led them to the rear of the church, where they could speak without being overheard. "The entire town council is there. Henderson, Judge Parker, Mayor Reynolds, and Brooks from the Mercantile. Morris brought 2 men with him. The others are patrolling the town, supposedly for security." "Armed?" Mason asked. Collins nodded. "Rifles and sidearms, professional-looking, not common gun hands." "Former military, most likely," Mason surmised. "Prescott seems to favor men with training." "The meeting started about an hour ago," Collins continued. "Morris presented some kind of proposal From what I could gather, Sweetwater wants exclusive mineral rights to all land within 5 miles of town, plus ownership of the watershed. Wilson frowned. That's half the county's farmland. And control of the water supply, Mason added grimly. Classic strategy. Whoever controls the water controls everything. Collins shifted uncomfortably. There's more. Henderson recommended accepting the offer immediately, but Judge Parker insisted on proper procedures and community input. That's when Morris mentioned you specifically, Mason. What did he say? That you'd been making unfounded allegations against Sweetwater in Virginia City, and that your interference might jeopardize the town's future prosperity. Collins hesitated. He suggested the town would be better served by more forward-thinking residents. The threat was thinly veiled, but unmistakable. Prescott was moving quickly, attempting to turn the town against Mason before he could reveal what he'd learned. We need to interrupt that meeting, Wilson decided. Present what we know before Henderson can push through this deal. Mason shook his head. Not yet. If we confront them directly, we'll show our hand without sufficient leverage. He considered their options. First, I need to check on my family. Then we need to secure the evidence Bryce gave us and gather allies we can trust. Dr. Elliot is trustworthy, Collins volunteered, and Howard from the saloon. Both refused Morris's invitation to a private discussion earlier. Good, Wilson nodded. Collins, go to Howard. Tell him we need his back room for a private meeting in 1 hour. Mason, check on your family, then meet us there. I'll gather anyone else I can trust. As they prepared to separate, Mason caught Wilson's arm. Be careful, Daniel. These men won't hesitate to eliminate obstacles. I've faced worse odds, Wilson replied with forced confidence. Not against professionals like these, Mason warned. Watch your back. Dr. Elliot's house sat on a quiet side street, a short distance from his medical practice. Unlike most homes in Willow Creek, it boasted a stone foundation and brick walls, a precaution against the fires that occasionally swept through frontier towns. Mason approached cautiously, noting with approval that the curtains were drawn and only a single light burned in what appeared to be the kitchen. He circled to the back door, avoiding the open street, and knocked softly in the pattern Emma would recognize. 2 quick taps, followed by 3 slower ones. The door opened almost immediately to reveal Emma, a revolver held discreetly behind her skirt. Her eyes widened at the sight of her husband, then quickly darted past him to check for followers. Thomas, she whispered, pulling him inside and securing the door. Thank God you're back safely. Are the children all right? Mason asked, embracing her briefly. Asleep upstairs. Dr. Elliot gave Sarah some chamomile tea for her nightmares. Emma studied his face. What's happening, Thomas? These strangers asking. About you, the emergency town meeting. It's complicated, Mason began, then decided his wife deserved the full truth. Jonathan Prescott, the man who offered me the job, is trying to acquire control of the land around Willow Creek. We believe the Blackwater gang was working for him, sent to retrieve documents from Henderson's office. Emma processed this information quickly. And now Prescott's men are here to finish what Blackwell couldn't, or to ensure we can't interfere with whatever they're planning next. Mason moved to the window, carefully peering through a gap in the curtains. Prescott's representative, Morris, is trying to turn the town against us. They've already started, Emma confirmed. There are whispers that you've been spreading lies about a company that wants to bring prosperity to Willow Creek. Henderson's wife visited this morning, suggesting it might be better for everyone if we sold our farm and moved on. Mason's jaw tightened. Did she mention a buyer? Sweetwater Mining, Emma replied, confirming his suspicion, offering twice the market value. They're moving faster than I expected, Mason muttered, trying to isolate us before we can expose them. Doctor. Elliot appeared in the kitchen doorway, his normally kind face grave. Mason, good to see you in one piece. He gestured toward the kitchen. "Coffee's hot, and I suspect we have much to discuss." In the warmth of Elliot's kitchen, Mason outlined what they had learned in Virginia City, Prescott's pattern of intimidation and acquisition, the Pinkerton investigation, and the likely connection to the Blackwater gang. "Doesn't surprise me," Elliot said when Mason finished. "I treated a miner last year who'd been run off his claim north of here. Said Sweetwater hired men to sabotage his equipment and contaminate his water supply after he refused to sell." "Why? Didn't you mention this before?" Mason asked. Elliot shrugged. "Man was half delirious with fever. I wasn't sure how much to believe. Besides, Sweetwater had no presence here until now." "They've been planning this move for some time," Emma suggested. "The Blackwater gang's arrival wasn't coincidental." "No," Mason agreed, "and neither was my involvement. Prescott must have known who I was from the beginning." Elliot looked confused. "Why would your identity matter to him?" Mason and Emma exchanged glances. "My military background," Mason explained reluctantly. "My skill set would be valuable to someone like Prescott, either as an ally or an enemy to eliminate. Which means the danger won't pass easily," Emma concluded. "Prescott won't simply give up and leave." Mason nodded grimly. "No, he won't. Especially now that we've uncovered his connection to the Blackwater gang." He checked his pocket watch. "I need to meet Wilson at the saloon. We're gathering people we can trust to plan our next move." "I'll come with you," Elliot offered. "As a town doctor, I have some influence, and I've been suspicious of Henderson's sudden enthusiasm for this mining company." Mason turned to Emma. "Stay here with the children. Keep the doors locked and—" "No," Emma interrupted firmly. "The children are safe upstairs with Nancy Wilkerson watching over them. I'm coming too." When Mason began to protest, she added, "This concerns our home and family, Thomas. I won't be left out of decisions that affect our future." Mason recognized the determination in his wife's eyes, the same resolve that had sustained her through the difficult early years of their marriage and the challenges of frontier life. He nodded his acceptance. "Stay close to me." As they prepared to leave, Mason rechecked his rifle and revolver. The familiar weight of the weapons brought a clarity of purpose he hadn't felt in years. "Thomas," Emma said softly, touching his arm, "whatever happens, remember who you are now, not just who you were." Mason met her gaze, understanding her concern. The violence of his past had nearly consumed him once before. Now, with threats surrounding his family and home, the temptation to return to the cold efficiency of 3 Mile Mason was strong. "I remember," he assured her, though part of him wondered if the man he had become could stand against what they now faced without embracing the deadly skills of the man he had been. The back room of Howard's saloon had never been so crowded. By midnight, 15 people had gathered around the scarred oak table, where Mason and Wilson spread out the documents provided by Agent Bryce. Judge Parker studied the evidence with a grave expression, while Mayor Reynolds paced nervously by the door. Howard had closed the saloon early, turning away Prescott's men with claims of a broken water pipe. "These reports establish a clear pattern," Parker said finally, setting down a detailed account of Sweetwater's takeover of a mining town to the north. "Prescott uses the same methods repeatedly, first offering generous terms, then applying increasing pressure when refused. And the connection to the Blackwater gang is undeniable," Wilson added, pointing to witness statements describing enforcers matching the outlaws' descriptions. Mayor Reynolds stopped pacing. "But Morris has promised the railroad will come through Willow Creek if we accept their proposal. Do you know what that would mean for our town's future?" "I know exactly what it means," Mason countered. "Initial prosperity, followed by Sweetwater, controlling every aspect of commerce. They're not interested in the railroad for our benefit. They want the transportation route for their mining operations." Dr. Elliot nodded in agreement. "And once they control the watershed, they'll have leverage over every farm and ranch for miles. Henderson has already sold out, Howard disclosed grimly. Morris gave him a position as Sweetwater's regional banking representative, 10 times his current salary. Emma, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. The question isn't whether Sweetwater is a threat. It's what we can do about it. Morris has 6 armed men in town, probably more on the way, and he's already turning opinion against anyone who opposes the deal. Judge Parker stroked his beard thoughtfully. We could wire the territorial governor, request an investigation based on the Pinkerton evidence. That would take weeks, Wilson objected. By then, Morris could have secured enough land rights to make it irreversible. Or worse, Mason added grimly. Remember what happened to the miners who refused Prescott's offers? A tense silence fell over the room as each person contemplated the implied threat. Finally, Brooks from the Mercantile cleared his throat. What about the Blackwater gang? They're still in our jail, probably know enough about Prescott's operations to cause him significant trouble. Mason exchanged glances with Wilson. That's actually not a bad idea. Jedediah Blackwell has no loyalty to Prescott. He's just a gun. If we could convince him to testify about Sweetwater's illegal activities, he'd need incentive, Parker cautioned, and protection. Prescott wouldn't hesitate to eliminate witnesses. The incentive is simple, Wilson said. Reduced sentences. For cooperation, as for protection, he looked at Mason. I can handle that, Mason confirmed. Emma touched her husband's arm. You're talking about openly opposing Prescott. He'll retaliate, Thomas. He already has, Mason replied quietly. The moment his men started asking about our family. Mayor, Reynolds looked unconvinced. Even with Blackwell's testimony, it's our word against a powerful corporation. Morris has half the town council convinced this deal is our salvation. Then we need to show everyone exactly who they're dealing with, Mason decided. Force Morris to reveal Prescott's true intentions in front of the entire town. A plan began to take shape. Judge Parker would call a public town meeting for the following morning, ostensibly to discuss Sweetwater's proposal. Wilson would secretly arrange for the Blackwater gang to be present, ready to testify about their work for Prescott. Meanwhile, Mason and several trusted townsmen would secure strategic positions around the town hall to counter any violence from Morris's men. It's risky, Wilson admitted when they had finalized the details. If Morris suspects a trap, he might move against us before the meeting. Then we'll need to be extra careful tonight, Mason replied. No one travels alone, and everyone stays alert. As the meeting concluded, Mason pulled Porter aside. I need to speak with Jedediah. Can you arrange it without alerting Morris's men? Porter nodded. The jail has a back entrance through the storeroom. Morris's men are watching the front, but I can get you in unnoticed. The jail was dark and quiet when Mason slipped through the back door. Wilson waited inside, keys in hand. Blackwell's awake, the sheriff whispered. The others are sleeping. Mason approached the cell where Jedediah sat on his bunk, watching the visitor with curious eyes. Twice in 1 week, Jedediah remarked. I'm flattered by the attention, Mason. We need to talk about Jonathan Prescott, Mason said without preamble. A flicker of surprise crossed Jedediah's face before his expression returned to careful neutrality. Not familiar with the name. Save it, Mason cut him off. We know Sweetwater Mining hired the Blackwater gang for several operations over the past 6 months. We know you were sent to Willow Creek to retrieve documents from Henderson's office. Not to rob the bank. Jedediah studied Mason for a long moment. Suppose that were true, why would I discuss it with you? Because Prescott's men are in town, and they're not here to help you. Mason leaned closer to the bars. Think about it. You failed your mission. You got captured. You're a liability now, one that knows too much about Sweetwater's operations. Uncertainty crept into Jedediah's eyes. Sullivan's working on our release. The charges were reduced. Sullivan works for Prescott, Mason countered. The reduced charges were part of the plan to keep you quiet and controlled. The moment you're no longer useful, the implication hung in the air between them. Jedediah glanced toward the cell, containing his sleeping brother and companions. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally. "Testimony," Mason replied, "about the operations you conducted for Prescott, the illegal activities you witnessed. In exchange, Judge Parker is prepared to recommend significant leniency." "And what about Prescott's retaliation? Man like that has a long reach." "We'll provide protection during the transition to territorial custody. After that, you'd be transferred far from Prescott's sphere of influence." Jedediah laughed softly. "You make it sound so simple, but we both know Prescott won't let this happen without a fight." "I'm counting on it," Mason admitted. His response will reveal his true nature to the town. "Using me as bait, then?" Jedediah shook his head ruefully. "And here, I thought you were the honorable type, Mason. This isn't about honor. It's about protecting my family and this town." Mason's voice hardened. "Prescott threatened everything I care about. I'll use whatever advantage I can find." Something like respect flickered in Jedediah's eyes. "Maybe. We're not so different after all." He considered for a moment, then nodded. "All right, I'll testify, but I want written guarantees of our reduced sentences signed by the judge." "I'll have them ready by morning," Mason promised. As he turned to leave, Jedediah called after him. "Mason, Prescott's men, they're not common thugs. They're trained killers, ex-military like yourself." "I know." "Then you know tomorrow won't end without bloodshed." Mason paused at the door. "That's why I'm asking for your cooperation, not your courage. Stay inside, say your piece, and let me handle the rest." Jedediah's laugh followed him out. "Just like old times for you, isn't it? 3 Mile, Mason? Back in the killing business." The words haunted Mason as he made his way through the darkened town to Dr. Elliott's house, where Emma waited with the children. The old instincts were indeed returning. The hyper-awareness, the tactical assessment of every shadow and sound, the cold calculation of angles and distances. Part of him feared this reversion to his military mindset, while another part embraced the clarity it brought. Emma met him at the door, reading the outcome of his meeting in his expression. "It's happening, then?" "Tomorrow morning," Mason confirmed, checking that the doors and windows were secure. "Judge Parker has called a town meeting at 9. Blackwell has agreed to testify." "And after?" Emma asked, her eyes searching for him. "When will this be over?" Mason wished he could offer her certainty, but the truth was that confronting Prescott's operation meant making powerful enemies. "One challenge at a time," he said instead. "First, we save the town." Emma nodded, accepting the evasion for now. "The children are asleep upstairs. Dr. Elliott offered to keep them here tomorrow during the meeting." "Good. The further they are from what's coming, the better." They settled in for an uneasy night, taking turns keeping watch. Mason cleaned his Springfield one final time, the familiar ritual steadying his hands and focusing his mind. When dawn finally broke, he kissed his sleeping children goodbye and embraced Emma with fierce tenderness. "Be careful," she whispered. "Remember your promise." "Always," he assured her, though both knew some promises could not be kept in the heat of conflict. By 8:30, the town hall was filled with curious citizens. Judge Parker had spent the early hours discreetly informing trusted residents about the true purpose of the meeting, ensuring a solid core of support among the crowd. Wilson had positioned deputies at strategic locations, while Mason coordinated with Howard and Brooks to establish fallback positions if violence erupted. At precisely 9 o'clock, Judge Parker called the meeting to order. Morris sat in the front row, flanked by 2 of his men, his expression confident as he prepared to present Sweetwater's proposal. Citizens of Willow Creek, Parker began, we gather today to discuss the future of our community. Before we hear Sweetwater Mining's offer, I believe it's important to understand exactly who we're dealing with. Morris rose smoothly. With respect, Your Honor, the details of our proposal speak for themselves. Sweetwater Mining Corporation offers unprecedented opportunity for growth and prosperity, including prosperity for those who assist you in acquiring control of other people's property, Parker asked pointedly. Like bank manager Henderson, perhaps? A murmur ran through the crowd. Henderson, seated near Morris, shifted uncomfortably. I don't know what you're implying, Morris said, his composure slipping slightly. Our business arrangements are entirely legitimate. Are they? Parker gestured toward the side door, where Wilson now entered with Jedediah Blackwell in tow. Perhaps Mr. Blackwell can offer some insight into Sweetwater's business methods. Morris's face darkened as he recognized the outlaw. This is irregular, Judge. Allowing a criminal to address a town meeting, a criminal who worked for you, Mason called from his position at the back of the hall, carrying out Prescott's dirty work when persuasion failed. The crowd's murmuring grew louder as Jedediah took the stand beside Parker. Morris exchanged urgent whispers with his companions, one of whom slipped out the side door, presumably to alert the rest of their team. Tell them, Blackwell, Parker prompted, about your arrangement with Sweetwater Mining. Jedediah cleared his throat, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. My gang was hired through an intermediary last spring. Our first job was intimidating. A mining operation north of Virginia City, sabotaging equipment, threatening workers, making it clear the owner should sell to Sweetwater. Lies, Morris interrupted. This man would say anything to save himself from prison. We have corroborating evidence, Wilson countered, holding up the Pinkerton file. Witness statements, financial records showing payments to aliases used by the Blackwater gang. Mason watched as the townspeople began to shift away from Morris, their expressions changing from curiosity to concern. The strategy was working. Prescott's representative was losing control of the narrative. Our arrival in Willow Creek wasn't random, Jedediah continued. We were sent to retrieve documents from Henderson's office, surveys and property assessments related to potential mineral deposits, and the planned railroad route. All eyes turned to Henderson, who had gone pale. That's absurd, he stammered. I would never... We have copies of your telegrams to Sweetwater, Wilson interrupted. Correspondence with Morris himself about land evaluations and property, owners who might resist selling. The mood in the hall had shifted decisively. Where Morris had previously enjoyed attentive interest, he now faced open hostility from many of the assembled townspeople. This changes nothing, Morris declared, standing to address the crowd. Sweetwater still offers the best future for this community. Without us, the railroad will bypass Willow Creek entirely. Your farms will remain marginally productive. Your children will leave for opportunities elsewhere. Better than becoming servants on our own land, a farmer called from the back, to murmurs of agreement. Morris's expression hardened. I see Judge Parker and Sheriff Wilson have poisoned the well quite thoroughly. Perhaps direct evidence of Sweetwater's commitment would be more convincing than baseless accusations. He gestured sharply toward the rear doors, which opened to admit the rest of his men, now numbering 10, rather than the original 6. Each was armed, their weapons not directly threatening but prominently displayed. Sweetwater Mining will be establishing operations in this region, Morris announced, his tone brooking no argument. We've already secured key properties and water. Rights. Those who cooperate will benefit. Those who obstruct progress, he glanced meaningfully at Mason, will find themselves marginalized or relocated. The threat hung in the air, silencing the crowd momentarily. Then Mason stepped forward from his position at the wall. That's not how things work in Willow Creek, he said quietly, his voice nonetheless carrying to every corner of the hall. This community makes its own decisions. No amount of intimidation will change that. Morris smiled thinly. Mr. Mason, the farmer with the military background and the ancient shotgun. Prescott warned me about you. He turned to address the crowd again. This man has been spreading falsehoods about Sweetwater mining to serve his own agenda. Ask yourselves, who benefits if you reject progress and development? Who benefits if we surrender our independence? Mason countered, moving deliberately toward the front of the hall. Sweetwater doesn't bring prosperity, it brings control. Today it's generous offers, tomorrow it's reduced water rights and mandatory sales. The tension in the room had reached a breaking point. Morris's men had spread out along the walls, hands near their weapons. Wilson's deputies were similarly positioned, creating a precarious balance of force. Enough discussion, Morris declared. It's clear this town needs time to understand its situation more thoroughly. He nodded to his men. We'll adjourn for now, but Sweetwater's representatives will remain in Willow Creek to continue individual negotiations. As Morris turned to leave, Jedediah called out, "Tell Prescott I send my regards, and that his operations in Montana and the Dakota Territory will make for interesting reading in the territorial papers." Morris froze, then slowly turned back. "What did you say?" "My insurance policy," Jedediah replied with a cold smile. "Detailed accounts of Sweetwater's methods, names, dates, locations, all lodged with attorneys to be published if anything happens to me or my men." Mason watched understanding dawn in Morris's eyes, the realization that Blackwell had protected himself against Prescott's inevitable betrayal. The outlaw had been several steps ahead of everyone. "You're bluffing," Morris said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Try me," Jedediah challenged. "Prescott isn't the only one who knows how this game is played." For a moment, the outcome hung in the balance. Then Morris made his decision. With a sharp gesture to his men, he headed for the door. "This isn't over, not by a long shot." As Prescott's men filed out, the tension in the hall gradually dissipated. Judge Parker called for order, beginning a measured discussion of what the town had learned and how to proceed. The immediate threat had passed, but everyone understood that Sweetwater mining wouldn't abandon its plans easily. Mason slipped outside, following Morris and his men at a discreet distance. They gathered in front of the hotel, their discussion heated but too distant to overhear. "They're planning their next move," Wilson said, appearing beside Mason. "Probably sending for reinforcements." "Probably," Mason agreed. "But they've lost the element of surprise, and the town is unified against them now." Wilson nodded toward the jail. "What about Blackwell? That bit about insurance policies, was that part of your arrangement?" "No," Mason admitted. "That was his own strategy. Smart, too. Seems our outlaw is more cunning than we gave him credit for." Wilson sighed heavily. "This isn't over, is it?" "No," Mason confirmed. "Prescott will try again, with different tactics, but we'll be ready." He glanced back at the town hall, where the citizens of Willow Creek were taking their first steps toward organized resistance. "Next time, it won't just be me standing against them." In the days that followed, Willow Creek transformed. Under Judge Parker's guidance, the town established a formal committee to investigate land sales and water rights. Wilson expanded his deputy force, training volunteers in basic defense tactics. Mason helped organize the outlying farms into a mutual protection network, with riders ready to spread warnings at the first sign of trouble. The Blackwater gang, true to their agreement, provided detailed testimony about Sweetwater's operations, which Parker forwarded to the territorial governor and the Pinkerton Agency. In return, they received reduced sentences, still significant, but far less than they might have faced otherwise. On the day they departed for the territorial prison, Mason visited the jail one last time. Jedediah stood at the barred window, watching as the prison wagon was prepared outside. "Came to say goodbye?" the outlaw asked. "Came to say thank you," Mason corrected him. Your testimony helped save this town, Jedediah shrugged. Self-preservation, nothing more. Maybe, Mason acknowledged, but it was the right choice, regardless of motivation. The right choice, Jedediah repeated with a hint of amusement. Been a while since I worried about that distinction. He turned from the window to face Mason directly. What about you? Back to farming now that the excitement is over? Mason nodded. That's the plan. It won't last, Jedediah predicted. Men like us don't change our fundamental nature. The skills that make us dangerous don't fade away just because we'd prefer a quieter life. Maybe not, Mason conceded, but we can choose how to use those skills. He extended his hand through the bars. Safe journey, Blackwell. After a moment's hesitation, Jedediah accepted the handshake. Keep that old shotgun handy, Mason. Prescott's not one to forgive or forget. A month later, life in Willow Creek had returned to a tentative normalcy. The fall harvest was underway, keeping Mason busy from dawn till dusk. The Sweetwater Mining Corporation had withdrawn its representatives, though rumors persisted about their continued interest in the region. As Mason returned from the fields, one evening he found Emma on the porch, a letter in her hand. From Judge Parker, she explained, passing him the envelope. The territorial governor's response. Mason read the official correspondence with growing satisfaction. Based on the evidence provided, a formal investigation had been launched into Sweetwater's business practices. Jonathan Prescott had been summoned to testify before a grand jury. Most importantly, all land transfers and water rights negotiations in the country had been suspended pending the investigation's outcome. It worked, Mason said, somewhat surprised by their success. Prescott's been contained, at least for now. For now, Emma agreed, the qualification hanging between them. Both knew that men like Prescott rarely accepted defeat permanently. Later, that night, after the children were asleep, Mason took the ancient shotgun from its place by the door and carried it to the porch. The moonlight gleamed on the worn barrel as he began the familiar ritual of cleaning and oiling the mechanism. Emma joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the autumn chill. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked quietly. Mason considered the question carefully. Not the same way, he decided. Prescott will try different tactics next time. Legal challenges, political pressure, perhaps even legitimate business offers. And if those fail, then we'll face that when it comes. Mason reassembled the shotgun with practiced hands. But we won't face it alone. Emma leaned against his shoulder, her warmth a comfort in the cool night air. I'm worried, you know, when all this started, that you'd become him again, the man you were before we met. 3 Mile Mason, he murmured. Yes. She took his hand, her fingers tracing the calluses earned from years of farming rather than marksmanship. But I was wrong. You used his skills, without becoming him. Mason squeezed her hand gently. I had something to fight for beyond orders or reputation. That makes all the difference. They sat in companionable silence, watching as clouds drifted across the moon. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the harvest to complete, winter preparations to make, children to raise, a community to strengthen. But for now, in this moment of hard-won peace, Thomas Mason was exactly where he wanted to be, a farmer with an ancient shotgun, ready to defend what mattered most. The old weapon might have been mocked by those who didn't know better, but like its owner, it had proven its worth when it mattered most, not as an instrument of death, but as a symbol of the quiet strength that lay beneath the surface of an ordinary life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.